I am Dex. I am 75 years old and I spent 40 years pulling double shifts on the assembly lines of Detroit to build an empire for my family. I thought my son Preston respected the sacrifices I made, but last week a terrified young photographer called me at 2 in the morning. He had recovered some deleted files from a security camera I forgot about. When I drove to his studio and looked at the glowing monitor, I did not see a burglar breaking into my home. I saw my own son standing over my heavily medicated sleeping body. He was using my limp hand to bypass the biometric locks on my digital life. Before I tell you how I turned his greedy trap into a masterclass in silent revenge, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that a father's love should never be repaid with betrayal. The air inside the small photography studio smelled of burnt coffee and ozone. Trey, my young photographer, sat frozen in his chair with his hand shaking over his computer mouse. He had just showed me the first recovered image. It was a night vision still frame showing Preston standing next to my bed while I slept, but that was only the beginning. Trey swallowed hard and pressed the right arrow key on his keyboard. The image on the massive curved monitor shifted to the next frame. Then he clicked it again and again. The hidden camera in my bedroom was triggered by motion and set to burst mode, taking a high-resolution photograph every 2 seconds. Each press of the plastic keyboard key echoed in the dead silence of the studio like a judge slamming a heavy wooden gavel. Click, click, click. I was forced to watch a slow-motion horror film of my own flesh and blood violating my trust. In the second frame, Preston was reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. I recognized that jacket. I paid for it 5 years ago when he landed his first big corporate client. He pulled out a sleek rectangular object. Even in the eerie green tint of the night vision lens, I knew exactly what he was holding. It was my large iPad Pro, the one I strictly kept locked inside the bottom drawer of my heavy oak nightstand. Trey clicked the arrow key again. The next photo showed Preston hovering the tablet just inches above my sleeping face. His eyes were cold and focused. There was absolutely no hesitation in his posture. He did not look like a son checking on his elderly father. He looked like a corporate predator executing a hostile takeover. The screen of the tablet illuminated his features, casting harsh shadows across his jawline. It was the face of a complete stranger. Click. Preston reached down with his free hand. He gently took my right hand, which was resting on top of the heavy winter quilt. My hands are thick and heavy. They are permanently scarred from decades of grinding metal and pulling engines at the Ford plant. They are the hands of a black man who swallowed his pride and worked overtime so his family would never have to know what an empty refrigerator looked like. Preston lifted my rough, calloused hand with his soft, manicured fingers. He moved with the terrifying precision of a surgeon. He knew exactly how heavy a sleeper I was. He knew that the specific medication my cardiologist prescribed for my heart condition knocked me out completely for at least 6 hours every single night. He was banking on my medical vulnerability. Trey stopped clicking and froze on the next image. His breathing was loud and ragged in the quiet room. The camera had caught the exact moment of the ultimate violation. Preston had my right thumb pressed firmly against the circular home button of the iPad. He was using my thumb to bypass the biometric security lock. He was using the very body that broke itself to provide for him as a master key to break into my private life. Mr. Dex, Trey whispered, his voice trembling so much he sounded like a frightened child. I did not know what to do when I saw this. He is stealing your passwords. We need to call the police right now. I have my phone right here. We have all the proof we need to put him away for years. I did not answer Trey. I did not reach for his phone. I did not yell or pound my fists on the desk. Anger is a very loud emotion, and loud emotions make you careless. The rage I felt in that exact moment was not hot and fiery. It was absolute zero. It was a cold, quiet realization that the son I had loved and protected all my life was dead. He had been replaced by a greedy parasite wearing his face. I just stared at the screen, analyzing the details and letting the ice settle deep in my veins. Keep going, I told Trey. My voice was completely flat. It did not even sound like my own voice. It sounded like a military commander giving an order. Trey swallowed hard again, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He slowly pressed the arrow key. Click. The tablet screen was glowing bright in the dark room, meaning the thumbprint had been accepted. The device was fully unlocked. Preston was standing upright now, holding the active iPad in both hands. He was tapping rapidly on the glass screen. He knew exactly which applications to open. He knew the layout of my device intimately. He had planned this operation down to the second. He had probably watched me use it from across the room during our Sunday dinners, memorizing where I kept my important folders while pretending to ask about my health. Click. The next frame showed Preston looking down at his own personal smartphone and holding it up next to my iPad. He was taking pictures of my screen. He was copying my private documents. He spent what looked like several minutes just photographing every piece of secure information I had locked behind my fingerprint. The timestamp in the bottom right corner of the images showed the minutes ticking by. 3:21, 3:24, 3:28. For 10 agonizing minutes, my son stood over my vulnerable sleeping body and systematically stripped away my privacy. Click. The final photo in the sequence made my stomach turn over in disgust. Preston had finished his digital theft. He was putting the iPad back down on the nightstand. But before he slid it into the drawer, he pulled a small, square microfiber cloth from his suit pants pocket. He carefully and methodically wiped down the glass screen of the tablet. He wiped the home button where he had pressed my thumb. He was cleaning off my fingerprint and making sure he left absolutely none of his own. He was erasing the evidence of his crime like a seasoned criminal. Then he quietly pushed the drawer shut, turned around, and walked out of the camera frame, leaving me sleeping in the dark, oblivious to the knife in my back. Trey pushed his chair back away from the desk and ran his hands over his face. "I cannot believe this," Trey mumbled. "Your own flesh and blood." "Mr. Dex, I am so incredibly sorry. Let me call the precinct. I know a detective down there who handles elder abuse. We can have him arrested before the sun even comes up." "No," I said. I placed my heavy hand on Trey's shoulder. "Do not call anyone. Do not say a single word about this to another living soul." Trey looked up at me, his eyes wide with confusion. "But why? He robbed you. He invaded your home. He could be draining your checking accounts right this very second." I turned my gaze back to the massive monitor, looking closely at the glowing screen of the iPad in the frozen photograph. My mind was moving with the brutal efficiency of an engine. I was piecing together the timeline. This happened a month ago. That meant Preston had this information for over 4 weeks. Why had he not drained my checking accounts? Why had my daily finances and pension funds remained completely untouched? Because he was not after the small change. I leaned closer to the monitor, my nose almost touching the warm glass. I looked closely at the dark protective case surrounding the iPad in the photo. It had a thick, rugged edge and a very specific small scratch on the bottom left corner. It was not my everyday tablet. It was not the one I used to read the morning news or play online chess or video call my sister in Atlanta. The air suddenly left my lungs as the realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. That specific iPad was completely disconnected from my personal bank accounts. It did not hold my pension funds. It did not have my daily checking applications. It only had one specific purpose. It was the offline device I used exclusively to manage the master ledger and the digital security keys for the family real estate trust. When I retired from the auto plant, I did not just sit on my porch and wait to die. I took my savings and bought a rundown duplex. I fixed it up with my own 2 hands and rented it out. Over 20 years, I turned that one single duplex into a massive portfolio of 14 commercial and residential properties across the growing districts of Detroit. I put everything into a legal trust to ensure that when I passed away, the wealth would generate passive income for generations of my family. I built an empire quietly, carefully, and successfully. The trust held the deeds, the corporate structures, and the master financial routing numbers that controlled over $4 million in equity. And that iPad was the only gateway to the entire kingdom. Preston did not want to steal a few $1,000s from his old man to pay off a credit card. He wanted the entire empire. He had photographed the master passwords and the digital signatures required to authorize transfers within the trust. But he could not just move the properties immediately. The lawyers would notice. The banks would trigger massive fraud alerts if a sleeping old man suddenly transferred $4 million in real estate to his son in the middle of the night. He was waiting for something. He needed a triggering event. He needed a legitimate legal reason for me to step down as the head of the trust. Or worse, he needed a reason to activate the medical power of attorney he had begged me to sign 2 years ago. Suddenly, the events of the past few months began to align in my head with terrifying clarity. After my minor heart attack, Preston had been the one to insist on bringing me my daily pill organizers. He was the one managing my medication doses. He was the one who kept telling my friends and relatives that my mind was slipping slowly, planting the seeds of doubt about my mental competence around town. He was not just stealing my money. He was carefully orchestrating my physical and mental decline so he could take over the trust legally and lock me away in a home. A cold smile crept onto my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a man who has just seen the entire chessboard clearly for the first time. Preston thought he was playing against a tired, lonesome old man who was slowly fading away into the background. He forgot that I survived the toughest streets of this city. He forgot that before I was a quiet old man, I was a survivor who never backed down from a fight. "Print every single frame of this video, Trey," I said, my voice steady and hard as steel. "Put them in a secure, waterproof envelope. Then completely wipe this hard drive. I want no digital trace of this discovery left anywhere on this computer or the cloud." Trey nodded quickly, his fingers flying across the keyboard to execute my commands. "What are you going to do, Mr. Dex?" "I am going to let him think he won," I replied, turning my back to the monitor and walking toward the studio door. "I am going to let him step right into his own trap. And then I am going to take back everything that is mine and leave him with absolutely nothing." The freezing wind whipping off the Detroit River hit me like a physical blow as I walked out of Trey's studio and stepped into the empty street. The sky was still a bruised purple, holding on to the last hours of the night. I walked over to my old Ford truck and climbed into the driver's seat. I did not turn the key in the ignition right away. I just sat there in the dark cab listening to the metal of the engine block ticking as it cooled down in the winter air. My hands were resting on the steering wheel. I looked down at my thick, scarred fingers in the dim glow of the street lamp. Preston thought these hands were ignorant. He thought because I grew up poor and spent my youth pulling engines on the Ford assembly line that I did not understand how the modern world worked. He was wrong. What Preston never fully understood was that the auto plant was just my starting line. I did not build an $8 million real estate empire by just swinging a hammer and getting lucky. I took my auto plant wages and taught myself the contracting business from the ground up. I became a self-made commercial contractor. For 30 years, I read municipal zoning codes at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. I negotiated supply chain contracts with steel mills. I learned how to read a financial ledger as easily as I could read a building blueprint. I built my wealth brick by brick, contract by contract. I knew exactly how money moved. And I knew that when a rat is cornered, it always goes for the biggest piece of cheese it can carry. I reached into my heavy winter coat and pulled out my cell phone. The digital clock on the dashboard read 5:45 in the morning. It was early, but in the world of private wealth management, money does not sleep. I dialed a personal cell phone number I knew by heart. It belonged to Arthur Sterling, the senior branch manager at the private bank that held my family trust. Arthur and I had done business together for over 15 years. I had helped his son get a summer job on one of my construction sites to teach him the value of hard work. We respected each other. The phone rang 3 times before Arthur picked up. His voice was thick with sleep, but he answered immediately. "Arthur, it is Dex," I said, my voice low and steady. "I am sorry to wake you up before the sun." Arthur cleared his throat and the sound of rustling bedsheets came through the speaker. "Dex, it is all right. Are you okay? You never call this early unless a pipe burst at one of the commercial properties." "No pipes burst, Arthur," I replied, staring straight ahead at the frosted windshield of my truck. "I need you to pull up the master ledger for the family trust right now. I need a verbal confirmation of the total asset allocation and any recent encumbrances." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Arthur breathing heavily. I heard the sound of him walking down a hallway and opening a door to his home office. I heard the quiet hum of his computer booting up. "Dex," Arthur said, his voice suddenly sounding very awake and very cautious. "Is everything all right with your memory medication? We talked about this yesterday afternoon." My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "What do you mean we talked about this yesterday, Arthur? I have not spoken to you in 3 weeks." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the rapid clicking of Arthur's mouse over the phone. "Dex," Arthur said, his tone shifting from friendly to strictly professional. "Yesterday at 2 in the afternoon, your son Preston initiated a digital transfer of authority. He used your private offline iPad to submit the electronic medical power of attorney. The biometric verification came through perfectly. He submitted a sworn affidavit from your cardiologist stating that your cognitive decline was accelerating. He said you were stepping down as the managing director of the trust and he was assuming full executive control. He said you were right there in the room with him when he submitted it." I closed my eyes. The cold air inside the truck felt like it was freezing the blood in my chest. Preston had used the fingerprint he stole from me in my sleep to bypass the highest level of bank security. He had officially locked me out of my own life's work. "What did he do next, Arthur?" I asked. My voice did not shake. I refused to let the panic show. "Give me the exact financial movements." Arthur let out a heavy sigh. Dex, you know I cannot legally discuss the details if you are no longer the authorized manager. The system has locked your verbal passcode out. Arthur, I interrupted, my voice cutting through the air like a steel blade. 15 years ago, you were a junior loan officer drowning in bad debt, and I was the only contractor who trusted you with my accounts. I built your branch. You are going to look at that screen, and you are going to tell me what my son did to my money. I heard Arthur swallow hard. The clicking of his mouse resumed. He leveraged everything. Dex, Arthur whispered, sounding sick to his stomach. He did not liquidate the properties. He used the electronic power of attorney to authorize a massive commercial margin loan. He cross-collateralized all 14 of your debt-free properties. Explain the structure. I demanded, my mind instantly slipping back into the calculating contractor I had been for decades. He took out a high-risk variable rate loan against the entire $8 million equity of the trust. Arthur explained, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He extracted $6 million in cash, and he wired the entire amount to the corporate holding account of his own commercial real estate development firm. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying violence. Preston's real estate firm was not doing well. I had heard rumors around town that his newest luxury condo project downtown was bleeding cash because of severe structural issues and permit delays. He was facing bankruptcy. The banks had probably cut off his funding lines, so instead of failing like a man, he decided to use my life savings as his personal bailout fund. What are the terms of the margin call, Arthur? I asked, my chest tightening with every word. It is a strict 30-day liquidity covenant, Arthur replied. Dex, this is a toxic loan structure. If his commercial firm misses a single development milestone, or if his corporate credit rating drops another point, the bank will issue a margin call. They will demand the $6 million back immediately. And if his firm goes bankrupt and he cannot pay it back, I said, finishing the equation for him, what happens to the trust? Arthur went completely silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of genuine sorrow. If his company defaults, the bank will foreclose on the trust. They will seize all 14 of your properties. They will liquidate your entire portfolio at auction prices to recover the $6 million. I sat there in the freezing truck processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Preston had built an absolute firewall around himself. He transferred the $6 million in cash to his corporate entity. If his luxury condo project failed, his corporate entity would simply declare bankruptcy, protecting his personal assets. He would walk away clean. But the debt would remain attached to my trust. The bank would come after my properties. I would lose the duplex I renovated with my own hands. I would lose the commercial plaza that paid for my late wife's cancer treatments. I would be left with nothing but an empty bank account and a mountain of legal fees. But losing my own comfort was not what made the cold fury ignite in my stomach. The trust was never meant for me to live a lavish lifestyle. I drove an old truck and lived in a modest house because that $8 million was meant for the next generation. It was meant for Maya. Maya is Preston's 16-year-old daughter. She is my only grandchild. She is a brilliant, kind-hearted girl who wants to study medicine and become a pediatric surgeon. We spend every Sunday afternoon sitting on my porch talking about her biology classes. The entire purpose of the real estate trust was to ensure that Maya would never have to take out a single student loan. It was designed to pay for her medical school, her first house, and her future children. Preston was not just robbing me, he was gambling away his own daughter's future to save his bruised ego and his failing business. If his company collapsed, the bank would wipe out Maya's inheritance overnight. He was willing to sacrifice his own child's dreams just so he could keep driving his imported sports car and wearing his custom-tailored suits. Thank you, Arthur, I said quietly, breaking the long silence. I will handle it from here. Dex, wait, Arthur pleaded. You need to call the authorities. You need to file an injunction for elder fraud. I can try to freeze the accounts, but the electronic signatures are legally binding until a judge says otherwise. If you do not move fast, the money will be locked into his construction contracts by noon today. Do not freeze anything, Arthur, I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who is preparing for war. Do not flag the account. Do not let Preston know that I called you. Let the wire transfer clear completely. But Dex, if his company goes under, you and your granddaughter will be left with millions in debt. You will lose everything. Arthur, I said, leaning my head back against the cold leather seat of the truck. A contractor never demolishes a building while the rats are still hiding in the walls. You wait until they are all gathered in the basement. Then you seal the exits and flood the foundation. Let him have the money today. I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. The sun was finally beginning to rise over the Detroit skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I turned the key in the ignition, and the heavy engine of the Ford truck roared to life. Preston thought he had trapped an old man in a financial corner. He thought his corporate lawyers and his biometric tricks made him invincible. But he forgot one fundamental rule of the construction business. The man who builds the house always knows where the load-bearing walls are. And more importantly, he knows exactly which pillars to kick out to bring the whole damn roof crashing down on the people's heads inside. If my son wanted to play a high-stakes game of commercial real estate, I was not going to run to the police and cry like a victim. I was going to step onto his playing field. I was going to use my 30 years of contracting knowledge to dismantle his precious luxury development project from the inside out. I was going to make sure his company collapsed, but I was going to make sure the explosion only burned him. I put the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb. I had 30 days before the bank issued a margin call and destroyed my granddaughter's future. It was time to go to work. Sunday dinner at my son's house was always an elaborate performance. I parked my old Ford truck at the end of his long, circular driveway, making sure not to leak any oil on his imported Italian paving stones. The house was a massive, modern mansion in the most expensive suburb of Detroit. It had floor-to-ceiling glass windows, manicured hedges, and a custom oak front door that cost more than my first duplex. Preston had bought it 3 years ago to project the image of a highly successful luxury real estate developer. But as I walked up the stone steps, I knew the truth. I knew that every brick, every pane of glass, and every blade of grass was currently balanced on a $6 million margin loan he had stolen from my granddaughter. I rang the doorbell and waited. The air was cold, but my mind was completely focused. I had spent the last 3 days since my meeting with the bank manager carefully mapping out my retaliation. Tonight was not about confrontation. Tonight was a reconnaissance mission. I needed to look the enemy in the eye and see how well he could lie to my face. The heavy door swung open and my granddaughter Maya stood there with a bright smile. She was 16 years old, wearing a simple, oversized sweater and holding a thick biology textbook. "Grandpa, you made it," she said, wrapping her arms around my neck. I squeezed her tight, closing my eyes for a brief second. The smell of her floral shampoo grounded me. She was the only reason I had not burned this entire house down to the ground. "I brought you those articles on pediatric surgery I promised," I told her, handing her a manila folder. Her eyes lit up, and she thanked me profusely, leading me into the grand dining room. The dining table was made of reclaimed mahogany set for 4, with heavy silver cutlery and crystal wine glasses. Preston was standing by the head of the table holding a bottle of expensive red wine. He was wearing a cashmere sweater over a crisp collared shirt, looking like he had just stepped out of a wealthy lifestyle magazine. He had spent his entire adult life trying to erase his working-class Detroit roots. He adopted this pretentious country club persona, mimicking the wealthy white executives he desperately wanted to impress. He changed his accent, he changed his wardrobe, and he changed his loyalties. "Dad, you made it," Preston said, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. He walked over and patted me on the back, a hollow gesture that made my skin crawl. We were just about to open the wine. It is a very rare French vintage I picked up at the charity auction last week. I looked at the bottle and calculated how much interest his fraudulent loan was generating per hour. "Sounds expensive," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Only the best for my family," Preston replied, flashing a brilliant white smile. His wife Keisha walked into the room carrying a large porcelain serving dish. Preston immediately rushed to her side, taking the dish from her hands with a dramatic display of chivalry. "Let me get that for you, my love," he said, kissing her softly on the cheek. "You work too hard making these beautiful meals for us. Sit down and let me pour you a glass of wine." I watched the performance in silence. Preston was playing the role of the perfect affluent husband to absolute perfection. He pulled out Keisha's chair for her, he complimented her dress, and he gently touched her shoulder as he poured the vintage red wine into her crystal glass. To the untrained eye, it was a picture of domestic bliss. But I am a contractor. I know how to spot a fresh coat of paint hiding a rotting foundation. As we sat down and began to eat the roast beef and winter vegetables, Preston took control of the conversation. He talked loudly about his upcoming golf tournament at the exclusive country club. He talked about the new luxury vehicles he was looking to lease for his executive team. He painted a picture of absolute financial dominance. He was putting on a show, making sure Keisha and Maya believed that the man at the head of the table was a titan of industry. But I was not looking at his cashmere sweater or his crystal glass. I was looking at his hands. His fingers were trembling just slightly when he lifted his fork. Every time his cell phone buzzed in his pocket, his eyes would dart quickly to the side and a muscle in his jaw would tighten. He was sweating. It was a cold, dry sweat. The bank must have started sending him the preliminary milestone requirements for the $6 million margin loan. The pressure of the impending bankruptcy was slowly crushing him from the inside out, and he was drinking the expensive wine far too fast to calm his nerves. "So Dad," Preston said, leaning back in his chair and swirling the red liquid in his glass, "how are things down at the old neighborhood? Still driving that rusty truck around trying to fix leaky pipes yourself?" He asked the question with a condescending chuckle, looking at Keisha to share the joke. It was his subtle way of reminding everyone at the table that I was just a blue-collar worker. He loved to emphasize the difference between his clean, manicured hands and my rough, scarred knuckles. "The truck runs just fine," I replied slowly, chewing a piece of meat. "And fixing leaks is how I put you through that fancy private college, Preston. I prefer to fix my own problems instead of paying someone else to hide them." The smile on Preston's face slipped for a fraction of a second. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes, but he quickly buried it under another layer of fake charm. "Well, you have certainly earned your rest, old man," he said, raising his glass to me. "You do not need to worry about the heavy lifting anymore. I have everything under control now. My firm is expanding. We are about to close a massive deal downtown that will secure our legacy for the next 50 years. I looked at him without blinking. A massive deal downtown. He was actually sitting at the dinner table looking at his innocent daughter and bragging about the fraudulent loan he had just taken out against her future. The sheer arrogance of his lie was almost suffocating. He really believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He really believed that, because I did not wear a suit and tie, I was incapable of understanding his complex financial crimes. "That is wonderful news," Daddy, Maya said, beaming with pride. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "You work so hard for us." Preston smiled warmly at his daughter and kissed the back of her hand. "Everything I do is for you, sweetheart," he said softly. "I am building an empire so you will never have to worry about a single thing in your life." The food in my mouth tasted like ash. I had to grip the heavy cloth napkin in my lap to stop my hands from reaching across the mahogany table and grabbing him by his throat. He was looking into his child's eyes and lying with the practiced ease of a psychopath. If his luxury condo development failed next week, the bank would foreclose on the trust. Maya would lose her college tuition, her inheritance, and her future. And this coward was sitting here drinking French wine and playing the hero. I swallowed my anger, pushing it deep down into the cold, dark place in my chest. "Not yet," I told myself. "You do not strike until the trap is fully set." As the dinner wound down, Keisha went to the kitchen to bring out the dessert. Maya excused herself to run upstairs and put away her biology books. For a brief moment, it was just Preston and me sitting alone in the large dining room. The silence between us was heavy and thick. Preston finished his third glass of wine and set the crystal down on the table with a soft clink. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany wood. The fake smile was completely gone now, replaced by a look of deep, calculated concern. "Dad, we need to talk," Preston said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "I have been meaning to bring this up with you for a few weeks now." I looked at him, waiting. I knew exactly what was coming. The architect was about to lay down the final brick in his narrative. "I am worried about you," Preston continued, furrowing his brow and looking at me with absolute false pity. "You have been acting a little strange lately. You seem confused. Keisha mentioned that when you came over last month you forgot where the guest bathroom was, and today you looked lost when you parked in the driveway." I stared at him, letting his words hang in the silent air. I had built the guest bathroom in this house with my own hands when he remodeled the first floor. I knew where every single pipe and wire was located. "I am not confused, Preston," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Preston sighed and reached across the table, placing his soft, manicured hand on top of my calloused one. It was the exact same motion he had used in my bedroom when he stole my thumbprint. "It is okay, Dad," he whispered, sounding like a tragic movie character. "There is no shame in getting older. The mind slips. The doctors warned us that your heart medication might cause some severe cognitive decline. I just want you to know that you do not have to carry the burden anymore." He was planting the seed. He was officially setting the stage to justify why he had to take over the real estate trust. He was going to use this narrative to explain the electronic power of attorney to the rest of the family and his corporate lawyers. He was going to paint himself as the grieving, dutiful son who stepped in to save his poor, senile father from financial ruin. You should let me handle the heavy decisions from now on, Preston said, squeezing my hand gently. You look so tired, Dad. You look like you are forgetting where you are. I think it is time we discuss a full transition of your responsibilities before you make a mistake that you cannot fix. I looked down at his hand resting on mine. Then I looked up into his cold, calculating eyes. He thought he was watching the sun set on an old fool. He had no idea he was staring straight into the eye of a hurricane. Maybe you are right, son, I said, pulling my hand away slowly. Maybe I am just an old, tired man. But you should be careful. Sometimes old men remember things that other people desperately want them to forget. The rain was coming down hard when I pulled my old Ford truck into the parking lot of a rundown diner on the south side of Chicago. I had driven all the way from Detroit in the middle of the night just to meet a man who did not exist on any official corporate payroll. His name was Marcus. We grew up together on these exact streets back when the neighborhoods were rougher and people had to watch each other's backs just to survive. Marcus and I used to play basketball on the cracked asphalt courts before he decided to join the police force. He spent 20 years becoming one of the best financial detectives in the city. He retired early after taking a bullet to the knee during a botched drug raid on the west side. Now he worked entirely off the grid as a private investigator specializing in deep forensic accounting. He was exactly the kind of man who could find a single missing dollar hidden inside a massive maze of international shell companies. I did not trust the expensive corporate lawyers who wore tailored suits in Preston's social circle. I trusted the men who learned how to read people in the gutters and who knew what real betrayal looked like. I walked into the diner and shook the heavy freezing water off my thick winter coat. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. It was completely empty except for an exhausted waitress wiping down the front counter and a massive man sitting quietly in the back booth. Marcus was nursing a black coffee and staring out the dark window at the passing cars. I walked over and slid into the vinyl booth across from him. He did not smile when he saw me. He did not offer any warm greetings. He just pushed a thick, heavy manila folder across the sticky surface of the table. It is much worse than you originally thought, Dex Marcus said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that cut through the quiet diner. Your boy is not just a bad businessman who made a few mistakes. He is running a massive financial illusion, and the walls are finally closing in on him. I opened the heavy folder. The first page was a highly complex organizational chart, filled with dozens of red arrows pointing between different limited liability companies and corporate holding accounts. Preston always bragged loudly about his luxury real estate development firm at our Sunday dinners. He told everyone in the family that he was building high-end modern condominiums for the wealthy elite of the city. He drove the imported sports cars and wore the expensive watches to prove it. But looking at the forensic financial report Marcus had carefully compiled, the truth was entirely different. Explain this absolute mess to me, Marcus, I said, staring down at the complicated maze of fake corporate names. Marcus leaned forward, resting his massive muscular arms on the table. Preston's main development company is nothing but a hollow shell Dex. He has not actually finished a single construction project in over 4 years. Every time he starts a new luxury building, he takes out massive high-interest loans from private lenders. But instead of using that money to buy steel and concrete, he uses that new money to pay the interest on his older overdue loans. It is a classic Ponzi structure wrapped up in a legitimate real estate development facade. My chest tightened with cold anger as I flipped to the second page of the extensive report. It showed a long, detailed list of severe structural code violations and dozens of unpaid contractor invoices from his latest downtown residential project. The city municipal board revoked his active building permits 3 months ago. Marcus continued, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. His primary subcontractors completely walked off the job site because they have not received a single payment since early last year. His corporate bank accounts are overdrawn by hundreds of thousands of dollars. He owes money to suppliers, investors, and the tax board. He is drowning in debt, Dex. The primary bank was getting ready to seize all of his personal luxury assets and throw him headfirst into bankruptcy court by the end of the month. That is exactly why he desperately needed the $6 million from my family real estate trust, I said, the puzzle pieces finally snapping together perfectly in my mind. He needed a massive injection of totally clean cash to pay off his most aggressive private creditors and keep his personal luxury lifestyle afloat for a little while longer. Marcus shook his head slowly and let out a heavy sigh. That is exactly what I thought at first, too, old friend. I assumed he was simply going to use your $6 million to plug the massive holes in his sinking corporate ship. I thought he was trying to save his business from going under. But your son is not planning on saving his business at all, Dex. He is planning a permanent escape. I looked up from the heavy file, feeling a sudden drop in my stomach. What do you mean he is planning an escape, Marcus? Marcus reached his large hand across the table and tapped a specific thick page in the back of the folder. Turn to page 7, he said, his eyes narrowing. I turned the page carefully. It was a digital copy of a highly encrypted international banking schedule that Marcus had somehow managed to intercept. It clearly showed the entire $6 million margin loan sitting quietly in a temporary corporate holding account under Preston's name. But the money was not scheduled to stay there to pay off his debts. He set up an automated wire transfer, Marcus explained, his dark eyes locked intensely onto mine. The banking system is programmed to automatically move the entire $6 million into a completely untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The wire transfer is officially scheduled to execute at exactly midnight on the 30th of this month. The breath completely left my lungs. The reality of his evil plan hit me harder than a physical punch to the jaw. If that money successfully went to the Cayman Islands, it would be completely gone forever. It would be entirely untouchable by United States courts. It would be untouchable by the commercial bank. And it would be totally untouchable by me. Once that money crosses those international borders, you will never see a single penny of your life savings again, Marcus said grimly. Preston is going to let his domestic development company completely collapse. He is going to let the bank foreclose on your family real estate trust and completely wipe out your innocent granddaughter's inheritance. He will formally declare personal bankruptcy here in the States, playing the victim of a bad economic recession to all of his wealthy friends. And then a few short months later, he will quietly slip away to the Caribbean and live like an absolute king on your stolen wealth. I stared down at the scheduled international transfer date printed on the paper, the 30th of the month. I looked at the calendar on the diner wall. That was exactly 21 days away. Preston truly thought he had the perfect unpunishable crime completely plotted out. He thought he could easily sacrifice my entire legacy and destroy his own daughter's bright future just to save his own skin and his massive ego. He thought I was just a senile old fool who would not even notice the money was missing until it was entirely too late to stop him. Thank you, Marcus, I said quietly, closing the thick manila file and sliding it into the deep pocket of my winter coat. You did incredible work here. I owe you my life for this information. What is your play here, Dex? Marcus asked, leaning back in the vinyl booth and crossing his arms. If you take this file to the police right now, they might be able to freeze the offshore transfer before it executes. But it will absolutely tie up your entire trust fund in federal court for years. You will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just trying to prove he stole your fingerprint while you were sleeping. The system moves incredibly slow for black men like us, Dex. You know that better than anyone. I am not going to this police, Marcus, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. The police only enforce the law. They do not enforce actual justice. If I let the federal courts handle this, Preston will just hire a team of expensive defense attorneys and drag this out until I am dead and buried. He will use my own money to fight me in court. Marcus let out a low, sharp whistle. You are playing a very dangerous game, old friend. He legally possesses the electronic power of attorney right now. If he successfully moves that cash out of the country, he wins the whole game and you lose your entire empire. I stood up from the booth and looked down at the former detective. He only wins if the money is actually sitting in that account ready to be moved, I said. He scheduled the international transfer for the 30th, but he clearly forgot that a smart independent contractor always controls the main supply lines. I am going to drain his corporate holding accounts completely dry before he even gets the chance to pack his tropical bags. Marcus finally cracked a small, dangerous smile. Be careful out there, Dex. Your boy is desperate, and desperate men do foolish things when cornered. I walked out of the diner and stepped back into the freezing Chicago rain. The clock was officially ticking down. I had exactly 21 days to secretly infiltrate Preston's hollow corporate empire, dismantle his complex financial structure, and take back every single dollar he stole from Maya. And I was going to execute my plan so quietly and efficiently that he would not even realize his life was ruined until he tried to buy his first-class plane ticket to paradise. The old man he thought he outsmarted was about to teach him a permanent lesson about respect. The heavy thud of a glass bottle hitting my solid oak kitchen table broke the quiet peace of my Thursday evening. I did not flinch. I slowly looked up from the evening newspaper. Preston was standing in the center of my kitchen wearing a sharp tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. He had a tight, confident smile plastered on his face, and his soft, manicured hands were resting on a bottle of 18-year-old single malt scotch. He did not bother to knock. He just used the spare brass key I gave him 10 years ago, back when I actually believed he was a good son who cared about his aging father. I looked at the expensive golden liquid inside the heavy glass bottle. Preston only bought imported scotch when he was celebrating a major victory or when he was about to stab someone squarely in the back. Tonight I knew with absolute certainty that it was both. "I poured us a drink," Dad Preston said, pulling out a wooden chair and making himself comfortable across from me. He reached into my glass cabinet without asking and grabbed 2 crystal tumblers. He poured the amber liquid with practiced, arrogant ease. "Drink up, old man. We need to have a very serious conversation about your immediate future." I did not touch the crystal glass. I just folded my newspaper carefully and placed my heavy, calloused hands flat on the table. "My future is just fine, Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "The roof does not leak because I patched it myself. The furnace is running warm. I have everything I need right here in this house." Preston took a slow, arrogant sip of his expensive scotch and let out a long, patronizing sigh. He leaned back in the chair and slowly looked around my kitchen. His eyes traced the worn edges of the wooden cabinets and the faded patterns on the linoleum floor. "You cannot stay here forever, Dad," he said, his tone shifting from friendly to deeply condescending. "This neighborhood is changing rapidly. It is getting rough out there on the streets. The demographics are shifting. It is simply not safe anymore, especially not for a senile old black man living all by himself in a big empty house." The cruel words hung in the warm kitchen air like a thick, poisonous cloud. A senile old black man. He said it so casually, so effortlessly. He was using my advanced age and the color of my skin as psychological weapons against me in my own home. He conveniently forgot that I marched in the civil rights protests in the bitter cold of the 1960s. He forgot that I stood guard on this exact front porch with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun during the summer riots to protect this property from looters. I bought this piece of land when the downtown banks flatly refused to lend money to hard-working men who looked like me. I built the very walls he was sitting between with my own bleeding hands. But to my son, I was no longer a father or a provider. I was just a tired old liability, standing squarely in the way of his $6 million offshore escape plan. I did not raise my voice. I did not pound my fists on the table or demand his respect. Anger is exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to yell and act erratic so he could use it as further proof of my mental instability. I just stared directly into his dark eyes, waiting patiently for him to play his final calculated card. "It breaks my heart to see you struggling like this, Dad." Preston continued, putting his crystal glass down and leaning aggressively across the table. "Keisha and I have been talking a lot lately. We found a beautiful assisted living facility out in the quiet northern suburbs. It has round-the-clock medical care. It has beautiful manicured gardens and armed security guards at the front gate. It is exactly what you need at this vulnerable stage of your life. You can finally rest and let someone else do the heavy lifting." I looked at him without blinking. "And exactly how much does this beautiful facility cost, Preston?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Preston waved his hand dismissively, acting as if money was a trivial matter. "Do not worry about the finances, Dad. I will handle all the complicated paperwork. I will officially take over the family trust and make sure your monthly facility fees are paid in full every single month. You will never have to look at another confusing bank statement for the rest of your life. You can just relax." He reached inside the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He placed them gently on the oak table and slid them across the polished wood until they were resting right in front of my hands. I looked down at the bold black letters printed clearly at the top of the very first page. It was a comprehensive transfer of executive financial authority and an irrevocable medical power of attorney. But that was not the document that made my blood run cold. Lying directly beneath those legal transfer pages was a certified medical document bearing the official seal of the state hospital. I recognized the messy signature at the bottom of the page. It belonged to my own personal cardiologist. It was a sworn official declaration stating that I was suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline. The document legally certified that I was no longer mentally competent to manage my own financial affairs or make my own medical decisions. My son had not just forged my fingerprint on a digital tablet while I was sleeping. He had actively bribed, manipulated, or lied to my trusted doctor into legally signing away my basic human rights. The sheer evil of his master plan was breathtaking to witness in person. He had orchestrated every single detail with cold, ruthless corporate precision. He knew that if he just tried to steal the trust money outright, the bank regulators might investigate the sudden transfer. But if he had my doctor legally declare me incompetent, the probate courts would hand him the absolute keys to the financial kingdom without asking a single question. He would lock me away in a tiny, sterile room in a suburban nursing home where no one would ever listen to my complaints. The young nurses would just smile patronizingly and nod, calling me a confused old man, while my son completely drained my life savings to pay off his fraudulent commercial debts. And once the trust was completely empty, he would quietly wire the remaining funds to his hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands, leaving my innocent granddaughter with absolutely nothing. He was planning to bury me alive without ever putting a shovel in the dirt. Preston reached back into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He placed it deliberately on top of the stack of legal documents. He tapped the gold pen twice with his manicured index finger. "Sign the papers, Dad," he said, his voice entirely losing all of its fake warmth and synthetic concern. The loving sun mask was completely gone now. He was looking at me with the cold, dead, unblinking eyes of a hungry shark. "It is so much better if we just do this quietly as a family. If you try to fight me on this, I will just take this signed medical certificate straight to a probate judge tomorrow morning. I will have you formally declared a ward of the state. The legal courts will immediately freeze all of your personal assets. They will send uniformed police officers to this house to forcibly remove you from the premises and place you in a rundown state-sponsored facility. You know exactly how the system treats stubborn old black men who refuse to cooperate with the authorities. They do not treat them with dignity or respect. They treat them like dangerous problems that need to be locked away and heavily medicated." I looked at the heavy gold pen resting on the crisp white paper. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. He was giving me an absolute ultimatum. Sign away my entire $8 million empire voluntarily and go quietly into the dark night, or be forcefully dragged out of my own home in handcuffs and lose everything to the courts anyway. He truly thought he had me completely cornered. He thought he had carefully anticipated every single move and blocked every single exit. He was so incredibly arrogant that he did not even realize he was sitting across the table from a master builder. And a master builder never enters a room without knowing exactly where the weak load-bearing walls are located. I did not reach for the gold pen right away. I let the heavy silence stretch out in the kitchen. I let him sweat just a little bit. I looked at the glass of expensive scotch he had poured for me. I slowly reached out with my heavy, scarred hand and picked up the crystal tumbler. I brought it to my lips and took a long, slow drink. The liquor burned my throat with a fierce heat, but I did not flinch or break eye contact with him. I set the empty glass down on the wooden table with a firm, definitive thud. Then I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. Preston smiled. It was a cruel, victorious, deeply ugly smile. He relaxed his shoulders and let out a quiet breath of relief. He thought the game was officially over. He thought the old man had finally surrendered to his superior intellect. He had absolutely no idea that I was not signing a surrender document. I was signing his absolute destruction. 40 years pulling double shifts on the assembly lines of Detroit taught me one very important lesson about survival. The smartest man in the room is never the one talking the loudest. The smartest man is the one who knows exactly how to play the fool until the perfect moment arrives. The heavy gold fountain pen Preston had placed on my kitchen table reflected the pale overhead light. That cold piece of metal was not just a pen. It was a loaded weapon. My son had carefully orchestrated this entire evening to force my hand. He had the fake medical documents. He had the power of attorney. He was ready to throw me into a state facility and steal the $8 million empire I built for his daughter Maya. Preston sat across from me in his expensive navy blue suit. He was leaning back in his chair, radiating pure absolute arrogance. He truly believed he had backed an ignorant old man into an inescapable corner. He thought his expensive corporate lawyers and his bribed doctors made him completely untouchable. He assumed that because my hands were scarred from physical labor, my brain was too slow to understand his high-level financial crimes. He forgot that a master contractor never builds a house without installing a back door. I looked at the gold pen and I made a conscious choice. I decided to give my arrogant son the greatest theatrical performance of my entire life. I needed him to walk out of my house tonight believing with absolute certainty that he had won. I needed his ego to be so massive and so blinding that he would not bother to check his blind spots. I started by changing my posture. I let my broad, proud shoulders slump forward. I allowed my spine to curve, dropping my chin toward my chest to make myself look small, frail, and completely defeated. I began to take short, shallow breaths, making my chest heave, as if the simple act of sitting in the chair was exhausting my old lungs. I blinked my eyes rapidly, intentionally making my stare look cloudy, confused, and desperately frightened. When I finally reached out my hand to touch the heavy gold pen, I made sure my fingers trembled violently. It was not the shaking of a man suppressing rage. It was the pathetic, helpless shaking of a sick old man who had finally surrendered to his own weakness. My rough fingers brushed against the smooth metal barrel of the pen, and I purposely fumbled. I let the pen slip from my grasp and roll across the solid oak table. Preston let out a long, heavy sigh. It was a theatrical sound filled with fake pity, but deep inside his dark eyes I saw a flash of pure, greedy excitement. He was enjoying my humiliation. He reached forward and picked up the gold pen. He gently placed it directly into my shaking hand, wrapping his soft, manicured fingers around my calloused ones. "Just take a deep breath and sign the papers," Dad Preston said. His voice was incredibly smooth and toxic, like warm poison. "Everything is going to be perfectly fine. I am doing all of this because I love you and I want to protect you. You are just too tired to handle these heavy burdens anymore. Let me carry the weight for you." I looked up at him, letting my bottom lip quiver just a fraction of an inch. It was the most pathetic expression I could possibly muster. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Preston?" I asked, my voice cracking and wavering intentionally. "Are you sure the nurses will take good care of me at that facility?" Preston smiled, a warm, comforting smile that made my stomach turn over in disgust. "They have the absolute best medical staff in the entire state, Dad. You will have a beautiful private room with a lovely view of the gardens. You will make new friends, and I will come visit you every single Sunday. I promise. Now just sign your name on the dotted line right next to the red sticker." I slowly lowered the tip of the gold pen to the crisp white paper. I made sure my hand shook even harder as the black ink touched the page. I did not use my normal, strong, confident signature. I dragged the pen across the paper, pressing too hard in some places and too lightly in others. I created a messy, jagged scrawl that looked exactly like the handwriting of a man whose mind was rapidly deteriorating. I signed the master transfer of executive authority. Then I slowly turned the page, acting confused about where to sign next. Preston eagerly pointed to the bottom of the second page. I signed the irrevocable medical power of attorney. Each messy, trembling letter I wrote was a brilliant stroke of tactical deception. As soon as I crossed the final letter of my name, Preston snatched the documents off the table with lightning speed. He did not even try to hide his eager desperation anymore. He quickly scanned the messy signatures, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal pages to make sure everything was completely binding. A massive, victorious grin spread across his face. He held the absolute keys to the $8 million kingdom, and he honestly thought he had conquered me without firing a single shot. Preston folded the heavy legal papers carefully and slid them into the inner breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He patted his chest, feeling the papers resting securely against his heart. When he looked back at me, the fake warmth and the loving son act completely vanished from his face. His eyes were cold, hard, and utterly ruthless. "Pack a small bag tonight, old man," Preston said, his voice dropping its gentle tone and becoming an absolute command. "Do not bring any of your heavy tools or that useless junk from the garage. The nursing facility does not allow residents to keep dangerous items in their rooms. I will have a private medical transport van come pick you up at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Be dressed, be ready, and do not make a scene for the drivers." He did not wait for me to answer or agree. He simply turned his back on me and walked confidently toward the kitchen exit. He did not even bother to take his expensive bottle of 18-year-old single malt scotch. He left it sitting on my table like a careless tip left for a servant. I sat perfectly still in my wooden chair and listened to the sound of his expensive leather shoes walking down my hallway. I heard the heavy front door open and slam shut, echoing through the quiet house. A few seconds later, the loud engine of his imported luxury car roared to life in my driveway. I listened closely as the sound of the tires faded away into the freezing Detroit night. The house fell completely silent, and in that deep silence, my entire physical body transformed. The pathetic curve of my spine vanished completely as I sat up straight. My chest expanded, pulling in a massive breath of cold, clean air. The violent shaking in my hands stopped instantly, leaving my thick, scarred fingers as steady as solid rock. The cloudy confusion in my eyes completely cleared away, replaced by a sharp, burning, dangerous focus. The weak-old fool Preston thought he had just conquered ceased to exist. I was Dex the Master Builder, and the trap was now fully armed and locked. I stood up from the wooden table and walked over to the kitchen sink. I picked up the expensive bottle of scotch, unscrewed the cap, and poured the entire bottle of golden liquid straight down the drain. I watched it disappear into the pipes. I did not drink with traitors. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my cell phone. I did not call Marcus, the private investigator, this time. I called the one man Preston truly feared but did not even know existed. I called my lead civil litigation attorney. His name was Robert, and he was a ruthless corporate bulldog who specialized in destroying high-level financial fraud. Robert was not a cheap lawyer. He was the kind of man you hire when you want to burn a corrupt corporation straight to the ground and salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again. I had kept Robert on a secret retainer for 5 years, just in case my massive real estate portfolio was ever threatened by outside forces. I never imagined the threat would come from my own blood. The phone rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end. "Yes, Dex," Robert said, his voice completely alert despite the late hour. I stared out the dark kitchen window, looking at the empty driveway. My son just walked out of my house with the signed medical power of attorney. I said, my voice low, deep, and completely devoid of any mercy. He thinks he has total control of the trust. He thinks he is transferring the funds to his offshore account in the Cayman Islands in 21 days. "Understood," Robert replied, the sound of his fingers typing rapidly on a keyboard echoing over the line. "Do you want me to file the injunction tomorrow morning to freeze his access?" "No," I commanded, my grip tightening on the phone. "An injunction will just scare him into hiding the money somewhere else. We are going to let him load all the cash into his central corporate holding account. We are going to let him consolidate all of his stolen funds in one single place, thinking he is preparing for the offshore wire transfer." "Are you absolutely certain, Dex?" Robert asked, his tone turning deeply serious. "If we miss the window by even 1 minute, the money crosses international borders and it is gone forever. This is an incredibly dangerous game you are playing." "I am the one dealing the cards, Robert," I replied, my voice as cold as ice. "Tomorrow morning a medical van is coming to take me to a lockdown facility. I am going to let them take me. I need Preston to believe I am completely neutralized and trapped in a hospital bed. I need him to feel so safe that he drops all of his corporate defenses." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Robert spoke. "And what do you need me to do from the outside, Dex?" I closed my hand into a tight fist, feeling the raw power and determination flowing through my veins. "Prepare the trap," I said. "Contact the federal banking regulators and quietly flag his corporate entity. Do not stop his loans, just monitor them. Get everything ready for the massive asset seizure." I took a deep breath, letting the reality of my next words sink in. "Activate the federal plan," I commanded. "Lock all the financial doors. Let him burn." The clock on my kitchen wall read 4 in the morning. I had exactly 4 hours before my son would send a private medical transport van to forcibly remove me from my own home. I did not pack a small bag with soft slippers and comfortable pajamas like a good little patient. Instead, I walked into my bedroom, pushed aside the heavy oak bed frame, and pried open the loose floorboard I had installed 20 years ago. I pulled out a heavy, fireproof lockbox. Inside were the original paper deeds to every single piece of commercial and residential real estate I had ever purchased. The modern digital world is full of cheap tricks, hidden cameras, and stolen fingerprints, but in the brutal business of building things, nothing beats hard physical paper. I drove my old Ford truck through the freezing dark streets of downtown Detroit. The massive skyscrapers towered above me like giant glass monoliths in the night. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the most expensive legal building in the city. Robert, my civil litigation attorney, was already waiting for me in his corner office on the 40th floor. Robert did not sleep much. He was a legal shark who thrived in the deep, cold waters of corporate warfare. He was the kind of man you only called when you wanted to completely obliterate your enemy. When I walked into his office, he was standing by the massive window looking down at the sleeping city while drinking a cup of black coffee. "You are playing an incredibly dangerous game," Dex, Robert said, as I dropped the heavy fireproof box onto his polished mahogany desk. I reviewed the electronic filings your son submitted to the bank yesterday afternoon. The medical power of attorney is legally flawless. He found a doctor willing to completely risk his medical license for a fat payout. The state courts technically recognize Preston as the acting executive of your trust as of right now. Technically is a word that lawyers use when they know a structural wall is weak, I replied, sitting down in the heavy leather chair. He filed the digital paperwork, Robert, but I am still the original grantor of the estate. I have not been formally stripped of my legal rights by a sitting judge yet. We are operating in a very narrow gray area. Robert nodded slowly, walking over to his desk and setting down his coffee. That is correct, Dex. He filed the documents, but a probate judge has not officially ratified your medical incompetence. Until a judge actually bangs a wooden gavel, you are still legally Dexter Caldwell, the master owner of the assets. We have a very small window of absolute authority left. If we file an emergency civil injunction right now, we can freeze all the accounts before he moves the money offshore. I leaned forward, resting my scarred, calloused hands on the cool leather surface of his desk. I told you on the phone last night, Robert, I do not want to freeze the accounts. If we file a civil injunction, Preston will just hire a team of expensive defense lawyers. He will drag this entire mess out in the local civil courts for years. He will claim he was just trying to protect his sick father and that the offshore transfer was a legitimate real estate investment strategy. He will hide behind his complex corporate limited liability companies. Civil court is a slow, comfortable playground for rich boys with soft hands. I want to take him completely out of his playground. Robert raised an eyebrow, looking at me with genuine professional curiosity. What exactly do you want to do then, Dex? I want to completely change the fundamental nature of the money, I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold. Before I pulled heavy engines at the Ford plant, I spent 2 years carrying a rifle in the dense jungles of Vietnam. I still carry the jagged shrapnel in my left shoulder to prove it. I want you to immediately restructure my entire $8 million real estate portfolio. I want you to draft an irrevocable conditional donation. We are converting the private family trust into a federal veteran charity trust. Robert stopped moving. He just stared at me across the desk. The silence in the massive luxury office was heavy and thick. He slowly sat down in his high-backed chair and a cold, terrifying smile began to spread across his face. He finally understood the blueprints of the massive trap I was building. If you do that, Robert said, his voice dropping to a low, hushed whisper, you are basically donating the entire equity of your life savings directly to the United States government. The money will officially be designated as federal charity funds intended solely for disabled military veterans. You will completely lose all personal control of the asset until the condition of the trust is legally resolved in federal court. I am fully aware of the structural load, Robert, I replied without blinking or hesitating. Draft the papers right now. Robert opened his laptop and his fingers started flying across the keyboard with incredible speed. He was a master craftsman in his own right, and he was currently pouring the unbreakable legal concrete for my son's permanent prison. As he typed, he explained the beautiful, brutal mechanics of the federal anchor we were dropping squarely on Preston's head. In the world of law, the specific type of money you steal determines exactly who comes knocking on your front door. If Preston steals money from his elderly father, it is considered a simple civil dispute or local elder abuse. The local police handle it. They are slow, underfunded, and easily distracted by expensive defense attorneys in tailored suits. But if the money legally belongs to a registered federal charity, the entire game changes completely. By signing this document, Dex, you are retroactively reclassifying the $6 million margin loan your son just pulled out of your properties, Robert explained, his eyes fixed intensely on the glowing screen. The money sitting quietly in his corporate holding account right now will no longer belong to him or to you. From the exact second my notary stamp hits this paper, it will officially be classified as stolen federal assets. I watched the heavy commercial printer in the corner of the office spring to life, spitting out thick pages of dense legal text. The trap was absolutely perfect. Preston had secretly scheduled an automated wire transfer to send that massive $6 million to a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands in exactly 21 days. He thought he was cleverly stealing from his sick, confused old dad. He had absolutely no idea that the money he was currently holding had just become highly radioactive. Robert gathered the warm papers from the printer tray and laid them out neatly on the mahogany desk. He handed me a simple black ink pen. It was not a heavy gold fountain pen like the one my son tried to force on me in my kitchen. It was just a reliable tool for doing honest hard work. I took the pen and looked down at the massive stack of legal documents. This was the final absolute point of no return. Once I signed these papers, my entire empire would belong to the federal government. I was risking everything I had ever built with my own two hands. If my plan failed, my sweet granddaughter Maya would get absolutely nothing. But I knew that if I did nothing at all, Maya would lose it all anyway. I had to risk collapsing the entire building just to save the foundation. I pressed the tip of the pen to the crisp paper. My hand did not shake. It did not tremble or waver in the slightest. I signed my name with the strong, heavy strokes of a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he was doing. I did not pretend to be weak anymore. I signed every single page binding my life's legacy to the rigid federal veteran charity structure. "It is done," Robert said, gathering the thick stack of papers and stamping them heavily with his official state notary seal. "I am filing this directly into the secure federal registry right now. This document instantly overrides any local medical power of attorney Preston tries to use because federal charity laws completely supersede state probate courts. Your arrogant son is now unknowingly sitting on top of a massive ticking time bomb." I stood up from the heavy leather chair and walked over to the floor to ceiling glass window. The sun was just beginning to rise over the industrial skyline of Detroit, casting a cold, bright light over the concrete buildings and the freezing river. I thought about Preston waking up in his massive luxury mansion in the wealthy suburbs. I thought about him checking his corporate bank accounts and smiling at the $6 million sitting safely in his ledger. He probably felt like the smartest and most powerful man in the entire world right now. "He thinks he is going to the Cayman Islands," I said quietly, staring out at the distant horizon. Robert walked up and stood next to me, holding the freshly sealed federal documents against his chest. "He is not going to the islands." Dex, Robert said, his voice hard and absolute. "The moment his automated banking system tries to wire that stolen cash across international borders, it will trigger a massive federal banking alarm. He will not be dealing with local county detectives. He will be dealing directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of the Treasury." I nodded slowly, watching the city wake up below me. My son had tried to use the civil law to quietly erase me from existence. He tried to use a fake medical certificate to lock me in a sterile cage and steal my granddaughter's future. But he completely forgot that a man who spent his entire life building skyscrapers knows exactly how to drop a wrecking ball perfectly on target. Anyone who touches that money from this moment forward will instantly commit a severe federal criminal offense. The trap was completely set, and all I had to do now was go back to my house, sit on my porch, and wait for the rat to bite the cheese. I drove my old Ford truck back to my quiet house as the morning sun finally broke through the heavy gray Detroit clouds. The federal charity papers were signed and securely filed. The massive trap was officially armed and waiting. I parked my truck in the driveway and walked slowly up the concrete steps to my front porch. I sat down on the heavy wooden bench I had carved with my own hands many years ago. The freezing morning air stung my face, but I did not go inside. I was waiting for the private medical transport van that my son Preston promised to send. I was fully prepared to let them take me to the lockdown facility. I was ready to play the pathetic victim just a little bit longer so he would drop his guard completely. But the universe has a strange way of changing your plans when you least expect it. My cell phone vibrated violently in my heavy winter coat pocket. It was not the transport company calling to confirm my pickup. The name flashing brightly on the small screen was Maya. I answered the phone immediately. Maya usually never called me this early in the morning unless it was an absolute emergency. She was supposed to be at the downtown city hospital. She had earned a highly competitive spot in a high school volunteer program shadowing the top pediatric surgeons. It was her absolute dream to walk those sterile white hallways and save the lives of sick children. I remember when she was just 6 years old, walking around my living room with a plastic toy stethoscope, listening to the heartbeat of my old dog. I had worked double shifts at the auto plant specifically to make sure that dream would become a reality. But when I held the phone to my ear, I did not hear the excitement in her voice. I heard the sound of heavy, uncontrollable sobbing. She was crying so hard she could barely catch her breath. The sound of her tears felt like a hot, jagged knife twisting directly into my chest. I asked her what was wrong. I kept my voice incredibly calm and gentle. I told her to take a deep breath and just talk to her grandfather. Maya swallowed hard and her voice came through the speaker, small and completely terrified. She told me she was sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria, hiding in a corner booth. She had tried to submit a required financial deposit for an advanced summer medical camp. It was a prestigious academic program that guaranteed early admission to a top-tier medical university. To pay the deposit, she logged into her secure banking application on her phone. She opened the joint college savings account that I had personally funded for her since the day she was born. I had put thousands of hard-earned dollars into that specific account over the last 16 years. I had made Preston the legal financial custodian of the account because she was a minor, but the money was meant strictly for her education and nothing else. Maya told me she stared at her phone screen in absolute shock. The account balance was completely zero. Exactly $50,000 had been entirely wiped out in a single wire transfer yesterday afternoon. My blood ran completely cold. The $6 million commercial margin loan was not enough for Preston. His corporate debts must have been so aggressive and his private creditors so desperate that he could not even wait for the massive offshore transfer to clear at the end of the month. He needed fast liquid cash immediately, just to keep his angry contractors from ruining his reputation or reporting him to the authorities. So he did the most cowardly thing a father could possibly do. He reached directly into his own teenage daughter's college fund and stole her entire future just to buy himself a few more days of fake luxury. He completely drained the $50,000 that was supposed to make her a doctor. Maya was hyperventilating on the phone. The hospital intercom echoed softly in the background as she tried to compose herself. She told me she immediately called her father in a total panic. She thought someone had hacked their family bank accounts. She thought it was a massive banking error that could be fixed. I gripped the phone so hard the plastic casing began to crack under the intense pressure of my calloused fingers. I asked her exactly what Preston said to her when she called him. Maya choked back another heavy sob. She told me her father did not sound panicked at all when he answered the phone. He sounded perfectly calm. He sounded incredibly sad and deeply disappointed. He used his softest, most comforting voice. It was the exact same voice of a man who makes a living selling empty promises to vulnerable people. Preston told his crying daughter not to worry. He told her that nobody hacked the bank and that the financial institution did not make a mistake. Then he delivered the most evil, calculated lie I had ever heard in my entire life. He told Maya that the money was gone because I took it. He told his own innocent daughter that her grandfather had logged into the banking portal and erratically transferred the entire $50,000 out of her account. He painted a completely false picture of a sick, confused old man sitting alone in the dark, pressing buttons on a computer, without knowing what he was doing. He told her I was losing my grip on reality and moving money around aimlessly. He was aggressively manipulating her young mind. He was actively gaslighting his own child to cover up his desperate financial crimes. Maya told me that Preston sighed deeply on the phone, playing the role of the tragic hero perfectly. He told her that my mind was completely gone. He told her that my Alzheimer's disease was getting so severe that I was becoming a massive danger to the entire family. He said I was destroying their finances because my brain was rotting away from the inside. He told her that she should not be angry with me because I was just a sick old man who did not understand the real world anymore. He promised her he was going to fix the missing money eventually, and then he told her the final lie that made my vision turn completely red. He told Maya that he was sending me away to a secure medical facility today to stop me from doing any more damage to her future. He made it sound like he was locking me up to protect her. I sat perfectly still on my wooden porch listening to my beautiful granddaughter cry over a terrible mental disease I did not even have. She told me she was so sorry that my brain was getting sick. She told me she loved me and that she wished she could fix my memory. She was actually apologizing to me while her father was busy robbing her blind. My son was not just stealing my money anymore. He was actively trying to destroy the pure love and trust my granddaughter had for me. He was intentionally turning me into a monster in her eyes so he could play the savior. He was using my legacy as a shield for his absolute cowardice. I did not yell or curse on the phone. I kept my voice as smooth and steady as a quiet river. I told Maya to dry her tears. I told her to go back to her volunteer shift and focus on learning how to save lives. I promised her that her college fund would be completely restored and that her grandfather was not losing his mind. I told her I loved her more than anything in this world and hung up the phone. I stood up from the wooden bench. The private medical transport van was scheduled to arrive at my house in exactly 10 minutes. I was originally going to let them take me to the nursing home to keep Preston completely comfortable, but stealing from me was one thing. Breaking the heart of my granddaughter and poisoning her mind with vicious lies was a line that could never be uncrossed. I walked over to the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt. I was not going to any nursing home today. I was not going to play the helpless victim anymore. Preston wanted to blame his financial ruin on a crazy old man. It was time for him to find out exactly what happens when you wake up a sleeping giant and hand him a sledgehammer. I would not find out until much later exactly what happened when my granddaughter finally came home that evening. Maya had just finished a brutal 12-hour volunteer shift at the downtown city hospital. She walked through the heavy custom oak doors of Preston's luxury suburban mansion feeling completely drained of all her energy. Her feet were aching terribly in her white clinical shoes. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying alone in the hospital cafeteria earlier that morning. She had spent the entire day changing bedpans, bringing water to sick patients, and trying desperately not to think about her empty college savings account. All she wanted to do was go up to her quiet bedroom, lie down on her mattress, and try to process the terrifying idea that her beloved grandfather was rapidly losing his mind. But Preston was already waiting for her in the grand foyer. He did not let her rest. He knew she was physically exhausted and emotionally completely vulnerable. That is exactly when a predator prefers to strike. Preston was sitting in his expensive leather armchair, nursing a tall glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon. He stood up immediately when he heard the heavy front door click shut. He walked over to his daughter and wrapped his arms around her in a tight, comforting embrace. Maya collapsed heavily into his chest, burying her face in the soft fabric of his cashmere sweater. She was just a 16-year-old girl carrying the massive weight of a $50,000 theft that she honestly thought was caused by my rotting brain. Preston slowly stroked her hair and began whispering soft, reassuring lies directly into her ear. He told her how incredibly proud he was of her hard work at the downtown hospital. He told her she was going to be a brilliant and successful pediatric surgeon one day. He carefully built up her confidence just so he could completely tear down her sense of reality. "Come sit with me in the living room, sweetheart," Preston said, guiding her gently by the shoulders toward the massive velvet sofa. "We need to have a very difficult conversation about your grandfather." Maya sat down heavily on the velvet cushions, pulling her knees up to her chest defensively. She looked at her father with innocent, trusting eyes. She asked him if he had spoken to me since the morning panic. She told Preston that she had called me while she was at the hospital and that my voice sounded perfectly normal and completely calm. She said I had confidently promised her the missing college money would be fully restored and that there was nothing wrong with my memory. Preston let out a long, perfectly timed, heavy sigh. He leaned forward and took both of her small hands in his. He looked deeply into her eyes, projecting an image of absolute heartbreaking sorrow. "That is the absolute tragedy of severe dementia, Maya," he said, his voice thick with entirely fake emotion. "They have brief moments of total crystal clarity. They sound exactly like the strong people we have always loved. But it is just a temporary, cruel illusion. Deep inside his head, his brain tissue is physically deteriorating. He actually believes he can restore the stolen money because his mind has completely erased the terrifying fact that he carelessly threw it all away." Maya shook her head slowly as fresh tears began welling up in her exhausted eyes. "But he sounded so incredibly sure, Dad," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "He told me he was not sick at all, he promised me." Preston squeezed her hands tighter, leaning closer to her face. "Do you know what happens to Alzheimer patients when they finally realize they are losing control of their own lives?" Preston asked softly, using a calm, clinical tone. "They get incredibly angry. They get paranoid and delusional. They start blaming every single person around them for their own mistakes. He is going to tell you that I am lying to you. He is going to tell you that the professional doctors are lying. He might even become physically aggressive and dangerous. I am desperately trying to shield you from that ugliness, Maya. You need to focus all of your energy on your complex medical studies, not on managing a volatile old man who stubbornly refuses to accept his own tragic decline." Maya was too physically and mentally exhausted to fight back. She had spent the entire day surrounded by sick patients and complex medical diagnoses. When her father, a successful and wealthy man, used cold clinical terms to describe my fake condition, she slowly started to doubt her own instincts. Preston expertly played on her deep medical aspirations. He told her that as a future doctor, she needed to look at my situation objectively and scientifically, not emotionally. He said keeping me alone in my big empty house was a severe form of medical neglect. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of me leaving the gas stove on and burning my house to the ground. He described a hypothetical scenario where I wandered out into the freezing Detroit winter in the middle of the night without a coat and froze to death on the sidewalk. I simply cannot carry the guilt if he ends up hurting himself or someone else, Preston whispered, letting a single perfectly executed fake tear fall down his cheek. I love my father, Maya. He was a strong, proud contractor. It breaks my heart to see him reduced to this confused state. That is exactly why I have to make the hardest decision of my entire life. I have to put him in a secure lockdown facility where he can be monitored around the clock by trained professionals. It is the only responsible thing a loving son can do. Maya finally broke down completely. She leaned against her father's shoulder and cried bitterly, surrendering entirely to the false reality he had so carefully and maliciously constructed. She nodded her head slowly, agreeing through her tears that I desperately needed professional psychiatric help. She honestly believed she was helping to save my life. She had absolutely no idea she was handing her father the final moral justification he needed to lock me away and steal her entire inheritance. Once Preston clearly saw that Maya had fully accepted the terrible lie, his entire demeanor shifted subtly. The fake sorrow instantly vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating, practical energy. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and gently wiped the tears from her face. "You are so incredibly strong, Maya," he said, standing up briskly from the velvet sofa. "I will handle all the difficult legal paperwork and deal with the facility doctors. You just focus on resting for your exams. But we have a very tight timeline we need to strictly adhere to." Preston continued, his voice returning to its normal, commanding corporate tone. "Your mother, Keisha, and I have been talking all afternoon. Keisha's parents, Richard and Evelyn, are flying in from Boston this coming weekend to spend the Thanksgiving holiday with us." Maya looked up, confused by the sudden jarring change in topic. "What does the Thanksgiving dinner have to do with Grandpa Dex?" she asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Preston straightened the collar of his cashmere sweater and looked down at his daughter with a gaze as hard and cold as solid stone. "You know exactly how your grandparents are, Maya. They expect absolute perfection in this house. They are bringing several of Richard's wealthy corporate partners to the dinner party to discuss some massive commercial real estate investments that my firm desperately needs to secure our future." I knew all about Richard and Evelyn. They were wealthy, snobbish socialites who had always looked down on my blue-collar Detroit roots. They hated the fact that their daughter married the son of a man who worked in an auto plant with grease under his fingernails. Preston had spent his entire marriage desperately trying to impress them and win their financial approval. "We simply cannot have him wandering around the house during a high-profile dinner party, making a crazy scene and embarrassing this family in front of important corporate investors," Preston said, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "Richard and Evelyn have never been comfortable around him, even when he was completely sane. His mental condition is far too unpredictable right now to risk exposing him to our guests. We are going to finalize his mandatory transfer to the lockdown facility before the weekend arrives. We are going to permanently resolve the embarrassing problem with your grandfather before the Thanksgiving turkey is even carved." I woke up long before the sun on Thanksgiving morning. The house was completely silent except for the low hum of the old furnace working hard against the freezing Detroit winter. I lay in my bed staring up at the ceiling. Today was supposed to be a day of gratitude. It was supposed to be a day where families gathered around large tables to give thanks for their blessings and their health. But in my family, the holiday had been completely poisoned. My only son was planning to use this day of giving thanks to finally erase me from his life. He thought he was going to carve the turkey, drink his expensive wine, and then casually hand me over to 2 medical orderlies waiting outside with a transport van. He thought today was the day he finally won. I pushed the heavy winter quilt aside and stood up. My joints ached from the cold, but my mind was sharper than it had been in 20 years. Today I was not an old man suffering from severe cognitive decline. Today I was a master contractor preparing to completely demolish a rotten building. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the hot water. I shaved my face with slow, deliberate strokes using the old straight razor my own father had given me 50 years ago. I watched my reflection in the foggy mirror. My eyes were clear and hard. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a man preparing to go to war. I walked into my bedroom and opened the large cedar closet. I bypassed the comfortable, thick sweaters and the worn flannel shirts I usually wore around the house. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a heavy plastic garment bag. Inside was a custom-tailored 3-piece suit made of dark, charcoal gray wool. It was the exact suit I wore to my late wife's funeral. It was the suit I wore when I successfully negotiated my biggest commercial real estate contracts downtown. For a black man of my generation, putting on a suit like this was not just about looking nice. It was about commanding absolute respect in rooms where wealthy people desperately wanted to dismiss you. It was physical armor. I put on the crisp white shirt, buttoning it all the way to the collar. I slid my arms into the heavy wool jacket and adjusted the stiff cuffs. I looked at my scarred, calloused hands extending from the elegant tailored sleeves. It was the perfect combination of brutal physical labor and undeniable executive authority. I walked out of my bedroom and down the hallway to the kitchen. I made a pot of strong black coffee. The rich, bitter smell filled the empty house, bringing a strange sense of comfort. I poured a single cup and walked into the living room. The room was perfectly clean and highly organized. I had spent the previous night making sure every single piece of furniture was exactly where it belonged. I wanted Preston to walk into this house and feel completely comfortable. I wanted him to feel absolutely superior and completely safe. I set my coffee cup down on the small wooden end table next to my favorite heavy leather armchair. Then I walked over to the hallway closet and retrieved the massive manila folder. It was incredibly thick and heavy. This folder was the ultimate weapon I had spent the last 3 weeks carefully forging in the dark. I held it in my hands, feeling the heavy physical weight of the paper inside. Inside this folder was the absolute destruction of Preston Caldwell. It held the high-resolution burst mode photographs showing him stealing my fingerprint while I slept heavily under medication. It held the deep forensic accounting report from Marcus proving that Preston's luxury real estate firm was nothing but a hollow bankrupt shell. It held the printed banking logs showing the exact moment he selfishly drained $50,000 from his own teenage daughter's college savings account. And most importantly, it held the officially stamped and sealed federal legal documents. The documents that proved the $6 million he was confidently holding in his corporate account did not belong to him anymore. The documents that proved he was currently in illegal possession of stolen federal charity funds meant for disabled military veterans. I walked over to the heavy leather armchair. I carefully lifted the seat cushion and slid the massive thick folder completely underneath it, hiding it entirely out of sight. I smoothed out the dark leather, making sure there were no strange lumps or uneven edges. The trap was now fully armed and completely invisible to the naked eye. I sat down in the leather armchair right on top of the hidden folder and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The large grandfather clock in the corner of the living room ticked loudly, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Every single second brought my son closer to his own spectacular financial ruin. Preston had called me late last night playing the role of the loving son one final time. He told me that he and Keisha were bringing her wealthy parents, Richard and Evelyn, over to my house for a special Thanksgiving morning brunch before their big corporate dinner party later that evening. He said they wanted to spend some quality time with me. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew exactly why he was bringing his arrogant in-laws to my house on this specific morning. He wanted witnesses. He wanted Richard and Evelyn to see me acting confused and pathetic. He wanted them to watch the medical transport van arrive and forcibly take me away so he could play the tragic, heartbroken hero in front of his wealthy investors. He was using my planned destruction as a theatrical performance to secure his fragile social standing. I thought about Maya, my sweet, brilliant granddaughter. Preston had forced her to stay home today, telling her to rest and study for her upcoming medical exams. He deliberately excluded her from this morning visit because he knew Maya loved me deeply. He knew she might cause a scene or ask too many difficult questions when the medical orderlies arrived to drag me out of my own home. He was a coward who isolated his victims before he struck his final blow. He thought he was protecting his master plan by keeping Maya far away. He did not realize he was actually doing me a massive favor. I did not want Maya to be in the room when I finally dropped the heavy hammer. I did not want her innocent eyes to see the absolute monster her father truly was when his fake mask was finally ripped off his face. I looked out the large front window of my living room. The sky was a heavy bruised gray and small flakes of white snow were beginning to fall quietly on the frozen Detroit streets. It was a beautiful, bitter, cold morning. My mind was completely empty of all fear and all doubt. I had spent my entire adult life protecting Preston. I had worked until my back bled to give him a better life than I had. I had forgiven his extreme arrogance and ignored his blatant disrespect for decades simply because he was my own flesh and blood. But stealing from his own child and trying to legally lock me in a sterile cage was the absolute limit. You can only push a good man so far before he decides to push back. And when a man who has built massive commercial skyscrapers decides to push back, he does not leave a single brick standing. I finished my black coffee and placed the empty ceramic cup quietly on the wooden table. I leaned back into the comfortable leather of my armchair. I could feel the hard edges of the thick manila folder resting securely beneath the cushion right under my legs. It was my heavy anchor. It was my absolute justice. The grandfather clock struck 10 in the morning. The deep, resonant chimes echoed heavily through the silent house. They were exactly on schedule. A sleek black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled slowly into my driveway. The heavy tires crunched softly against the freshly fallen snow. I watched through the glass window as the powerful engine turned off. The heavy car doors opened. Preston stepped out first, wearing an immaculate camel hair overcoat and a smug, highly confident smile. Keisha followed him closely, wearing expensive designer winter clothes that she bought with my money. And then Richard and Evelyn stepped out of the back seats, looking around my modest working-class neighborhood with barely disguised disgust painted all over their wealthy aristocratic faces. They walked slowly up the concrete path toward my front porch. They looked exactly like royalty arriving to briefly inspect a dirty peasant village. Preston was gesturing grandly toward my house, probably telling them another carefully constructed lie about my rapidly failing mental health. He was probably explaining how incredibly tragic it was that I had to be institutionalized today for my own safety. He was completely blind to the brutal reality waiting for him inside the walls of my home. I took one final deep breath, filling my old lungs with freezing air. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, honoring the beautiful memory of my late wife, Sarah. I promised her on her deathbed that I would always protect this family from harm. Sometimes protecting a family means you have to pick up a sharp knife and completely cut out the deep infection spreading inside it. The sharp, sudden sound of the doorbell ringing shattered the absolute silence of the house. I did not move right away. I let the loud sound echo down the hallway and fade into the walls. They were standing right there on my front porch. The greedy wolves had finally arrived at the front door, expecting to find a sick, helpless lamb ready to be slaughtered. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked directly into the jaws of a waiting lion. The doorbell rang for the second time, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the house. I remained seated on my leather armchair, taking one final slow, deep breath. Directly beneath the heavy cushion I was sitting on was the thick federal file. It was the absolute death sentence for my son's fake corporate empire. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal wool suit, and walked down the hallway. I pulled the heavy wooden door open. Preston stood on the front concrete steps, flashing a brilliant smile that was entirely fake and perfectly practiced. Right behind him was Keisha, along with two people I never wanted to welcome into my home, Richard and Evelyn. They were Preston's wealthy, snobbish in-laws. They stepped over the threshold of my house without even bothering to wipe the wet, freezing snow off their expensive Italian leather shoes. Evelyn rolled her eyes immediately, looking around my modest working-class living room with the kind of deep disgust usually reserved for people born with silver spoons in their mouths. She pulled her expensive mink shawl much tighter around her narrow shoulders. She started muttering quiet complaints about the smell of old wood and the severe weakness of my central heating system. "Hello there, old man," Richard said, his booming voice filling the small hallway with absolute arrogance. He extended a soft pink hand that had never seen a single day of hard physical labor. "It has been a long time, Dex. You are looking quite a bit weaker than last year. I suppose old age is finally knocking loudly on your front door." I ignored his outstretched hand and kept my face completely blank. "I still have enough strength to frame a roof by myself, Richard," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "What about you? Are you still making your living just pushing numbers around on pieces of paper?" The arrogant smile on Richard's face froze for a fraction of a second. But Preston immediately jumped in to cut off the conversation before it could escalate. He wrapped his arm around my shoulder, patting me gently as if I were a confused medical patient who needed to be soothed. "Come on, Dad," Preston said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Today is Thanksgiving. We are not going to talk about work today. You need to sit down before you get dizzy. The doctors specifically said you should not be standing up for too long." He was putting on a brilliant theatrical performance. He desperately wanted to prove to his wealthy in-laws that I had become a massive physical burden and a senile old fool who needed strict daily supervision. I did not fight back. I quietly turned around and walked back to my familiar leather armchair. I slowly sat down right on top of the radioactive federal documents. I wanted to see exactly how far their pathetic little play would go before I completely destroyed the stage. Keisha carried several heavy shopping bags straight into the kitchen. She did not actually cook a single thing for this traditional Thanksgiving meal. She had simply purchased expensive pre-made dishes from a high-end luxury restaurant just to show off her supposed high-class status. She wanted to make sure everyone knew she did not belong in a humble kitchen. Evelyn sat down gracefully on the sofa across from me. She carefully smoothed out the wrinkles in her designer dress so the expensive fabric would not touch the worn cushions of my furniture. She stared intensely at the large oak grandfather clock in the corner of the room and let out a long, dramatic sigh. "This house is really far too large for a single elderly man like you, Dex," Evelyn said, her voice high-pitched and entirely condescending. "Preston and Keisha have been worrying themselves sick about you living here all alone. What if something terrible happens to you? What if you forget to turn off the gas stove or trip and fall down the wooden stairs? Older people at your fragile stage of life require constant professional medical care. You simply cannot keep clinging to the past forever." I looked directly into her cold, judgmental eyes. "The past you are talking about is my blood and sweat, Evelyn," I said. "Every single brick in this house was paid for with honest physical labor. It was not inherited from some massive generational trust fund." Richard cleared his throat, looking deeply annoyed by my response. "That is exactly the main problem with you, Dex. You have always had the narrow mindset of a simple blue-collar worker. The modern world operates on financial leverage, on smart investments, and on proper risk management. It operates exactly like the massive luxury condominium project Preston is building downtown. That is how you build a real lasting legacy. You should be incredibly proud that your son finally managed to rise above the low-class roots of this family to join the true financial elite." I almost laughed out loud right there in my living room. The true financial elite. The luxury condominium project Richard was praising so proudly was actually nothing but a massive mountain of toxic debt. It was an abandoned construction site filled with angry subcontractors preparing to file massive civil lawsuits. Preston had completely lied to his wife's entire family to cover up the absolute rot inside his bankrupt investment fund. Richard honestly thought he was sitting in my living room lecturing a poor, ignorant old mechanic. He had absolutely no idea that he was closely tied to a sinking ship. He did not know that his own son-in-law had just stolen $50,000 from his own teenage daughter just to keep the lights on for one more week. Richard was bragging about a financial genius who was actually about to drag his wealthy family straight down to the bottom of the financial ocean. The Thanksgiving meal was finally served, and we all moved into the dining room. My simple pine dining table rarely had to endure such an incredibly suffocating atmosphere. The expensive catered food was placed on my old ceramic plates. Preston played the role of the perfect wealthy host, pouring the expensive bitter red wine he had brought from his personal cellar. Throughout the entire meal, Richard constantly bragged about his multi-million-dollar corporate mergers. Evelyn endlessly praised Keisha for being so brave to marry into a family with such a low social standing. Every single word that came out of their mouths was a velvet-wrapped knife aimed directly at my pride. They talked about my decades working at the Detroit auto plant with a tone of overwhelming pity. They spoke about manual laborers as if we were a lower species of human beings who desperately needed the charity of people who wore expensive tailored suits and sat in air-conditioned offices. I remained perfectly silent. My absolute silence was not submission or defeat. It was the intense, focused silence of a master hunter watching his arrogant prey wander blindly into a lethal trap. I chewed my food slowly, listening to the empty, hollow sound of their incredible vanity. Preston occasionally placed pieces of food on my plate, reminding me to chew my food slowly. He spoke to me exactly like a nurse speaking to a disabled child. He was deliberately building the narrative of my severe dementia right in front of his wealthy audience. He kept glancing nervously at the expensive gold watch on his wrist. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. He was waiting for the private medical transport van to pull into my driveway and haul me away. He was absolutely convinced that his fake medical documents were enough to lock me away forever. He thought this entire Thanksgiving performance was just a convenient way to assert his total dominance and secure his inheritance in front of his wealthy in-laws. As the expensive catered dessert was finally brought to the table, the tension in the dining room rose to a level so thick you could cut it with a steel blade. The air felt heavy and charged with invisible electricity. Preston slowly wiped his mouth with a pristine white silk napkin. His dark eyes flashed with extreme malice and ultimate greed. He looked at the grandfather clock one more time. The transport van was supposed to arrive any minute now. It was time for him to execute the final stage of his hostile takeover. Preston slowly stood up to his full height. He picked up his heavy silver dessert fork. He tapped the silver metal gently against the rim of his crystal wine glass. The sharp, ringing sound echoed through the small dining room, immediately drawing the attention of everyone sitting at the wooden table. Richard stopped talking mid-sentence and looked up at him, smiling with eager anticipation. Evelyn folded her hands elegantly in her lap, waiting to hear what the successful young developer had to say. Keisha proudly reached out and grabbed her husband's hand, looking at him with absolute adoration. I was the only person who kept a completely cold expression. I stared dead ahead at the treacherous son, who was about to completely destroy his own life. "May I have your attention, please?" Preston said, his voice taking on a formal and deeply fake tone of authority. "Today, on this beautiful day of giving thanks, I have a very important announcement to share with all of you. It involves a remarkably difficult decision, but it is one that absolutely must be made for the good of this entire family." The absolute silence in the dining room was so thick it felt like it was suffocating me. Preston stood tall at the head of the wooden table, looking exactly like a victorious general who had just conquered an enemy territory. He looked down at the wealthy guests he was trying so desperately to impress, and then he finally locked his cold, dark eyes on me. There was absolutely no warmth or hesitation in his gaze. He had been waiting for this exact moment for weeks. He was finally going to strip away my freedom and my entire legacy right in front of his arrogant in-laws. Preston cleared his throat, and the sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. He began to speak using a deep, perfectly modulated voice that sounded like a practiced politician delivering a tragic speech on television. He talked about the heavy burden of family responsibility and the deeply painful decisions a loving son must make when his elderly parent begins to fade away. He spun a pathetic web of lies, explaining how my cognitive decline had rapidly accelerated over the past few months. He completely fabricated stories about me, wandering aimlessly through my own house and forgetting the names of my own family members. He painted a terrifying picture of a confused old man who was a constant physical danger to himself and everyone around him. Richard and Evelyn sat at my table and listened to his toxic lies with expressions of deep theatrical sympathy. Evelyn actually clicked her tongue and shook her head, acting as if she felt genuine sorrow for my pathetic condition. She even pulled a silk handkerchief from her designer purse and dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes. Richard nodded continuously, praising his son-in-law for having the incredible courage to make such a difficult executive decision. They were entirely captivated by the brilliant performance Preston was giving. They honestly believed he was a dedicated son carrying a tragic burden. They had absolutely no idea they were applauding a ruthless predator who was hiding his massive financial crimes behind a wall of fake morality. Preston reached his manicured hand into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. He slowly pulled out a thick folded stack of crisp legal papers. It was the exact medical power of attorney and the lockdown facility transfer order that he had forced me to sign with his heavy gold pen the night before. He held the documents up in the air, waving them gently as if they were a flag of absolute victory. Then he threw the heavy stack of papers onto my pine dining table. The sharp slapping sound of the paper hitting the wood shattered the fake, polite atmosphere of the room. Preston leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on the table. The tragic loving son act completely vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, ruthless glare of a corporate executioner. "You need to pack your bags tonight, old man," Preston said, articulating every single word with brutal precision. "Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, a private medical transport van is coming to this house. They are taking you to a highly secure lockdown facility in the northern suburbs. You will have round-the-clock medical supervision. You are completely incapable of taking care of yourself anymore, and I simply cannot allow you to be a liability to this family." He stood up straight again and turned toward his wealthy in-laws to deliver the second phase of his master plan. He confidently announced that the very moment the transport van took me away, he was going to contact a commercial real estate broker. He declared that he was putting my house on the market immediately. He told Richard and Evelyn that this working-class neighborhood had become far too dangerous, and that keeping the property was a massive waste of valuable equity. He claimed that the money from the sale of my house would go directly into a special fund to pay for my expensive medical care. But deep in my chest, I knew the absolute truth. He was going to use the money from my house to pay off his angry subcontractors. He was going to throw me out onto the street and sell the home I built with my late wife just to save his own miserable reputation. Evelyn immediately voiced her loud aristocratic approval. She stated that selling this rundown property in a blue-collar neighborhood was the smartest financial decision Preston had made all year. She muttered that holding onto a house in this zip code was an absolute insult to the high social standing of their family. Richard aggressively agreed, praising Preston's ruthless vision and his ability to quickly liquidate useless assets. At that exact dark moment, a loud, violent crash came from the front of the house. The sound of heavy, panicked footsteps echoed rapidly down the wooden hallway. The dining room door was pushed wide open. Everyone at the table jumped and turned their heads toward the sudden noise. Maya was standing in the doorway. She was still wearing her white hospital volunteer scrubs. Her face was completely soaked with tears, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying all morning. She had refused to stay quietly hidden in her bedroom like her father had violently commanded. The absolute terror of discovering her empty college fund and the agonizing fear of losing her grandfather had pushed her to the absolute limit. She had taken a city bus all the way to my house just to see me with her own eyes. Maya stared in absolute horror at the legal medical documents resting on the dining table. She had heard the end of her father's cruel speech. She had heard his plans to lock me in a sterile facility and sell the house I had loved my entire life. The deep emotional pain registered instantly on her young, innocent face. She took a few shaky steps into the dining room. "What the hell are you doing?" Dad, Maya cried out, her voice breaking into a desperate sob. "You cannot do this. You cannot throw Grandpa out of his own house. He is not sick. He is not losing his mind. I literally talked to him on the phone this morning, and he was perfectly fine." The sudden dramatic arrival of his teenage daughter completely ruined the perfect, sophisticated image Preston was trying to project to his wealthy in-laws. His face instantly turned dark red with boiling anger. The elegant corporate mask slipped entirely. He took 3 large aggressive steps toward Maya, grabbing her arm roughly and pulling her away from the table. "What kind of ridiculous stunt are you pulling?" "Maya," Preston hissed through his teeth, his voice dripping with pure venom. "I specifically told you to stay home and study for your medical exams. You are just a naive child. You have absolutely no idea how complex these adult medical issues are. Your grandfather's brain is physically dying, and he is a massive danger to himself and to us. You need to shut your mouth and accept the reality of the situation." Maya tried desperately to pull her arm away from his tight grip. She sobbed heavily, shaking her head back and forth, refusing to accept his toxic lies. Keisha quickly jumped up from her chair and rushed over to her daughter. She pulled Maya away from Preston and pushed her down into an empty wooden chair. Keisha's mother, Evelyn, scowled deeply, clearly disgusted by the loud emotional outburst ruining her expensive holiday meal. She decided to use her arrogant aristocratic authority to crush the poor girl. "You need to learn how to behave yourself properly, young lady," Evelyn said, her voice cold and sharp as glass. "You are interrupting a highly sophisticated family dinner and showing incredible disrespect to your father. He is making an incredibly painful sacrifice for the good of this entire family. You should be down on your knees thanking him instead of crying like a spoiled brat defending a senile old fool." Richard immediately joined the attack. He used his deep, booming business voice to lecture the terrified 16-year-old girl. He told Maya that human emotions were completely useless when dealing with serious financial and medical liabilities. He commanded her to stop being so incredibly weak and to look at the brutal facts of life. The entire Caldwell family formed a vicious circle of intimidation around my granddaughter. They used their loud voices, their aggressive authority, and their relentless psychological manipulation to completely break her spirit. They cornered her, forcing her to accept their corrupt version of reality. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching this disgusting display of human cruelty unfold right in front of me. I watched the heavy tears fall down my granddaughter's face. I watched the absolute ruthless cowardice of my own flesh and blood. I watched the arrogant wealthy in-laws treating my family like garbage. The burning rage inside my chest was a massive, roaring inferno. It was so intense it could have easily burned the entire house down to the foundation. But I did not explode. I did not yell or curse. I did not slam my heavy fists onto the wooden table. I knew that loud, chaotic anger was only for weak men who had lost control of their surroundings. A master hunter knows that the heart must burn like fire, but the mind must remain as cold as a frozen glacier. I knew that the absolute perfect moment had finally arrived. The enemies had moved all their pieces across the board. They had exposed their massive egos and their fatal structural flaws. I slowly moved my heavy, scarred hands out from under the table and placed them flat on the wooden surface. The movement was so incredibly slow and deliberate that it instantly commanded the attention of everyone in the room. The loud screaming and the vicious scolding of Maya stopped immediately. Every single eye in the dining room turned toward me. Preston smirked a highly victorious and arrogant smile. He crossed his arms over his chest, waiting patiently for me to beg for mercy. He was expecting me to cry and plead. He was expecting the broken surrender of an old, weak man who had finally realized he was entirely defeated. He wanted to enjoy his absolute victory. But I did not beg. My face was a mask of cold, hard stone. My dark eyes were deep and completely devoid of any fear. I slowly reached my calloused fingers forward and touched the edge of my expensive ceramic dessert plate. I pushed the plate away from me. The ceramic base scraped against the rough wood of the table, creating a sharp, harsh sound that pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. I looked directly into Preston's arrogant face. Then I slowly shifted my cold gaze to the confused faces of Richard and Evelyn. Finally, I looked across the table at Maya. I gave her a very small, slow nod of absolute reassurance. Then I smiled. It was a cold, dark, and incredibly dangerous smile. It was the smile of a man who held the detonator to a massive explosive charge. I took a slow, deep breath and let my voice fill the room with calm, terrifying authority. Before I go, I said smoothly, "Let us look at some wedding memories." The absolute silence in the dining room was no longer the silence of arrogance. It was the heavy, terrifying silence of a massive bomb that had just been armed. I looked directly into Preston's eyes. The cold smile on my face did not change. I did not need to shout or scream to prove the absolute truth. I just needed to let the darkness expose exactly what it had been hiding. I gave a very small nod toward the closed kitchen door. The heavy wooden door slowly pushed open. Trey stepped into the dining room. The young photographer looked incredibly nervous, but his dark eyes were completely resolute. He was carrying a small digital projector and a sleek laptop computer. He did not say a single word to anyone at the table. He just walked quietly over to a small wooden side table in the corner of the room and began connecting the electronic devices. The sudden appearance of a complete stranger in the middle of a private family dinner caught all the wealthy guests completely off guard. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, looking Trey up and down with deep disgust, as if he were a common servant who had walked through the wrong door. Richard angrily demanded to know who this young black man was and why he was interrupting their sophisticated holiday meal. Preston looked equally confused and deeply threatened. He glared at me and then loudly ordered Trey to pack up his cheap equipment and get out of his house immediately. But Trey completely ignored their arrogant threats. He calmly finished plugging in the thick black cables and pressed the power button on the projector. A blinding beam of bright white light shot across the room and hit the massive empty wall directly behind Preston's chair. The elegant cream-colored wall instantly transformed into a giant movie screen. The first high-resolution photograph appeared on the wall, bright and incredibly sharp. It was the eerie green night vision image captured by my hidden security camera. The picture clearly showed me sleeping heavily in my bed with my medical breathing machine strapped securely to my face. And standing right next to the edge of my mattress was Preston. He was wearing the exact same expensive tailored suit he wore to his corporate dinners. His face was angled down, staring intently at my vulnerable sleeping body. The loud sound of shattering crystal broke the absolute silence. Keisha had just dropped her expensive wine glass straight onto the hardwood floor. Dark red wine splashed everywhere, completely ruining her designer shoes, but she did not even notice. She was staring blankly at the massive projection on the wall with her mouth wide open in pure shock. Richard and Evelyn instantly turned to stone in their wooden chairs. The arrogant superiority on their wealthy faces was completely wiped away, replaced by total, absolute horror. But the person suffering the most in this dining room was Maya. My sweet, innocent granddaughter brought both of her hands up to cover her mouth. Her large eyes were wide and filled with absolute terror. She was looking at a massive high-definition image of her perfect, successful father sneaking into her grandfather's bedroom in the dead of night like a common thief. Trey did not hesitate or wait for them to process the shock. He reached down and pressed the right arrow key on his laptop. The second photograph flashed onto the wall. In this frame, Preston was reaching into his inner suit pocket and pulling out my secure digital tablet. The tablet I used strictly to manage the $8 million family real estate trust. Trey pressed the key again. The third picture delivered the ultimate fatal blow to Preston's carefully constructed web of lies. Preston was holding the tablet firmly in one hand, and he was holding my scarred, heavy hand in his other hand. He was physically lifting my thumb while I was deeply unconscious from my heart medication. Nobody in the dining room dared to take a single breath. The air grew incredibly thick and suffocating with the dirty, brutal truth. They were witnessing the ultimate act of family betrayal. They were watching a son actively steal the biometric fingerprint of his own sleeping father. They were seeing a crime of absolute moral bankruptcy documented clearly in high definition. Trey clicked through the rest of the burst mode sequence without mercy. Preston pressing my thumb against the glass screen to bypass the biometric security lock. Preston frantically tapping on the financial applications. Preston using his own personal smartphone to take multiple pictures of my private bank accounts and master passwords. He was stealing Maya's future. He was stealing my life savings. He was stealing my independence just to pay off his massive fraudulent corporate debts. The final photograph appeared on the giant wall. Preston was standing over me using a small cloth to meticulously wipe my digital tablet clean. He was carefully erasing his own fingerprints to hide his crime. It was the calculated action of a cold-blooded professional criminal. Trey took his hands off the laptop keyboard, took one step back, and stood quietly against the wall with his arms crossed. His specific job was completely done. The blinding light of truth had finally destroyed the shadows. The entire dining room plunged into a horrifying, stunned silence. Maya was the first person to finally break. She started sobbing violently, her small shoulders shaking uncontrollably. She turned her head and looked directly at her father with an expression of pure, absolute disgust and deep, agonizing pain. Only a few hours ago, Preston had held her in his arms and told her that I was suffering from severe dementia. He had psychologically manipulated his own teenage daughter, making her honestly believe that her grandfather was a dangerous lunatic who wasted her college fund. But the massive green photographs glowing on the wall told the exact truth. There was no tragic mental illness. There was no sad Alzheimer diagnosis. There was only a cowardly thief wearing the expensive mask of a loving father. "What the hell did you do?" Dad Maya screamed, her voice breaking under the weight of her massive heartbreak. "You snuck into his bedroom to steal his fingerprint. You stole my $50,000 college fund and you blamed it on a sick old man. You are a disgusting liar. You are an absolute monster." Evelyn clutched her chest, heavily gasping for air as if she were about to faint right into her dinner plate. She simply could not believe that the highly successful son-in-law she loved to brag about to her wealthy country club friends was actually a desperate criminal. Richard glared at Preston, his face turning bright red with extreme anger and deep public humiliation. He suddenly realized that he had been completely fooled by a cheap imposter for years. The entire shiny facade of Preston's extreme wealth and corporate success had just peeled away, revealing a rotten foundation that smelled like raw garbage. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my ice water. I did not need to offer any further explanations or defend my own sanity. The photographs had completely done my job for me. I had forced them to look at the ugly, naked truth. Preston stood frozen at the head of the table. His face was entirely pale, completely drained of all human color. His dark eyes were glued to the final photograph of himself wiping the tablet screen. His extreme arrogance, his absolute control, and his fake moral authority had just been crushed into fine dust. He opened his mouth to speak, trying to find some ridiculous excuse or some pathetic lie to salvage the last tiny shred of his dignity. But his throat was completely tight. There was absolutely no excuse that could possibly explain away the clear photographic evidence of his midnight robbery. He had been caught red-handed. His mask had been ripped off right in front of the very people he feared and worshipped the most. But a rat trapped in a corner does not usually surrender right away. It bites back with its final, desperate breath. In just a few short seconds, I watched the pure shock on Preston's face slowly melt away. The deep fear was quickly replaced by a wave of absolute total madness. The muscles in his jaw twitched violently. He took a massive deep breath and his chest heaved up and down. and then he started to laugh. It was not an apologetic laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a dark, hollow sound that erupted from deep inside his throat and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the maniacal laugh of a man who had completely lost his grip on his own humanity and decided to throw away his last remaining piece of moral decency. He laughed out loud, leaning his hands heavily on the wooden table and staring directly at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. Richard slammed his heavy fist down on the table, loudly demanding that Preston explain these incredibly disgusting images immediately. Keisha cried hysterically, asking her husband what kind of terrible things he had done behind her back. Maya backed away from the table, completely terrified by the crazy sound of her father's dark laughter. But Preston completely ignored all of them. He only looked at me. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, twisting into something incredibly cruel and evil. "You think you are so incredibly smart, do you not, Dad?" Preston hissed, articulating every single word with cold, dead precision. "You think a few sneaky hidden photographs are going to change the ultimate outcome of this game? You think exposing the absolute truth in front of these people is going to make me fall down to my knees and beg for your pathetic forgiveness? You really are the most naive and stupid old man in the entire world." He stood up straight and clapped his hands together a few times, sarcastically applauding my dramatic presentation. He admitted that I did a very good job hiding the evidence. He admitted that he severely underestimated my quiet intelligence. But then he reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out his personal smartphone, holding it up high for everyone in the room to see. "So what about the stupid photos?" Preston sneered triumphantly. "These damn photos might eventually take me to court, but what does that even matter when you are already completely broke? Did you honestly think I would be stupid enough to leave the money sitting in a domestic account where you could freeze it?" He took a few slow steps toward me, leaning down so his face was directly level with mine. His breath smelled heavily of expensive red wine mixed with the sour stench of total desperation and absolute greed. "I knew my company was going bankrupt weeks ago," Preston whispered, using a voice filled with pure malice. "I knew the domestic banks were going to seize absolutely everything I owned, so I accelerated the entire timeline. Do you know what today is, old man? This morning, right when the automated banking systems opened in the international time zones, the entire $6 million margin loan from your trust was officially wired out. The money left the domestic corporate account at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. It went straight into a network of anonymous offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, a place where absolutely no domestic judge or cheap local lawyer can ever touch it." He threw his head back and laughed crazily. The entire dining room sank into a feeling of overwhelming total despair. Richard slumped down in his wooden chair, realizing that his son-in-law had just successfully pulled off a massive international financial fraud. Maya covered her face and sobbed loudly, knowing her future was officially gone forever. Preston honestly believed he held the ultimate winning card. He believed that even if his entire family abandoned him today, he would still live like a king on a tropical island using my stolen wealth. "You cannot do absolutely anything about it, you stupid old man." Preston smirked, turning his back to me and preparing to walk out of the room. I looked at his arrogant retreating back and I felt the thick, heavy edge of the federal file resting securely beneath my seat cushion. I smiled again, a smile that was infinitely colder than the freezing Detroit winter. Preston's laughter bounced off the walls of my dining room like the desperate howling of a madman. He stood there with his chest puffed out, absolutely convinced that he had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. He thought the geographical location of the stolen money made him completely untouchable. He believed that the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were a magical, impenetrable shield that would protect him from the severe consequences of his extreme greed. He looked down at me, expecting to see a broken old man crying over a completely empty bank account. He wanted to see me beg, but he did not see tears. He saw me slowly reach down into the dark space beneath my heavy leather armchair. My rough, calloused fingers wrapped tightly around the thick manila folder I had carefully hidden there early this morning. I slowly pulled it out from under the leather cushion. The folder was incredibly heavy, filled with dense legal documents and the unbreakable concrete of federal law. I held it in my hands for a brief second, feeling the immense power contained inside those simple white pages. Then I lifted my arm and threw the massive folder directly onto the center of the wooden dining table. The heavy slap of the folder hitting the wood echoed through the room like a loud gunshot. The sudden harsh noise made Preston's arrogant laughter stop instantly. He looked down at the thick envelope, his dark eyes narrowing with sudden confusion and deep suspicion. Richard and Evelyn leaned forward in their wooden chairs, staring blankly at the mysterious package. Keisha stopped her hysterical crying, and Maya looked at me with wide, hopeful eyes. "Yes, Preston, the money is gone, I said, my voice perfectly calm and as hard as solid steel. It crossed international borders exactly at 6 o'clock this morning, just like you planned. You successfully bypassed the domestic courts, and you successfully avoided any local civil injunctions I could have filed against you. You executed your little midnight robbery perfectly. Preston smirked, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. Then why are you looking so damn smug, old man? You have absolutely nothing left to fight me with. You are completely broke, and I am walking away clean. I leaned forward, resting my heavy elbows on the table and looking directly into his cold, empty eyes. I am smiling because you are a very arrogant boy who never learned how to properly inspect the foundation of a building before trying to steal the valuable copper wire out of its walls. You thought you were stealing my personal life savings. You thought you were robbing a sick, confused old man who would just sit down and cry about his lost pension. But you did not steal my money, Preston. I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the manila folder. I slid the top document across the smooth wood until it rested right in front of his soft, manicured hands. It was the master restructuring document I had signed with my civil litigation attorney, Robert, at 4 o'clock in the morning. The document was stamped heavily with the massive official seal of the federal government. Pick it up and read the bold text at the top of the page, I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. Preston hesitated. His hands began to shake very slightly as he reached down and picked up the crisp white paper. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched his face closely as his brain slowly processed the complex legal terminology. I watched the exact moment his entire fake world completely collapsed. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet gray ash. His mouth dropped open, and he started gasping for air like a fish thrown violently onto a dry wooden dock. "What is this?" Preston whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "This makes absolutely no sense. This is a federal charity designation." I nodded slowly, letting the absolute brutality of the trap fully sink into his mind. "Exactly. You see, Preston, I knew you were going to try to move that money offshore. My private investigator Marcus gave me your entire digital banking itinerary weeks ago. I knew you desperately needed a clean $6 million to save your bankrupt luxury development firm. But I also knew that if I tried to stop you in a local civil court, you would just use your expensive lawyers to drag the fight out for years. So I completely changed the rules of the game. I stood up from my leather chair, towering over my treacherous son. Yesterday morning, before you even sent your fake medical transport van to my house, I completely restructured the entire $8 million family trust. I formally and irrevocably donated the entire equity of my real estate portfolio to a federal veteran charity trust. I legally designated those specific funds to be used exclusively for the medical care of disabled United States military veterans. I transferred that fund to federal assets. Richard let out a loud gasp of absolute horror. He was a seasoned corporate businessman, and he instantly understood the terrifying magnitude of what I had just done. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, covering his mouth with his trembling hand. "He did not steal from a private citizen. He stole from the federal government," I said, finishing Richard's sentence with brutal finality. "From the exact moment my attorney stamped those papers, the $6 million sitting in your temporary corporate holding account officially became federal property. And at 6 o'clock this morning, you authorized an automated wire transfer to send $6 million of stolen federal charity funds across international borders into a hidden offshore account." Preston dropped the legal document as if it had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward away from the table, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the hardwood floor. "No," he stammered, shaking his head frantically back and forth. "No, that is completely impossible. I had the medical power of attorney. I was the legal executor of the estate." "Your medical power of attorney was a cheap piece of local state paperwork," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Federal charity law completely supersedes local probate courts. You have just committed federal wire fraud against the United States Department of the Treasury. You stole money meant for wounded soldiers just to pay off your luxury sports cars and your bankrupt condominiums." The absolute reality of his situation crashed down on Preston like a collapsing skyscraper. He was not dealing with a slow local police department or a friendly county judge who could be easily bribed or manipulated. He had just kicked down the front door of the most powerful financial institution on the entire planet. He had triggered a massive automated federal banking alarm the very second that money hit the accounts in the Cayman Islands. Do you know the mandatory sentencing guidelines for international wire fraud involving a registered federal veteran charity? Preston sheesh, asked, my voice echoing through the silent room like a judge's final brutal verdict. It is 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. There is absolutely no bail for flight risks with offshore accounts. You are going to spend the next 2 decades of your life sitting in a tiny concrete box wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit surrounded by dangerous men who will not care at all about your expensive cashmere sweaters or your exclusive country club memberships. Keisha began screaming hysterically. She lunged at Preston, pounding her fists against his chest, demanding to know why he had destroyed their entire lives. She screamed that she was going to lose her massive suburban house, her luxury cars, and her perfect social standing. Preston did not even try to defend himself. He just stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic failure. His eyes were wide and completely empty. Evelyn grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him aggressively toward the front hallway. "We are leaving right now, Richard," Evelyn shrieked, her voice filled with absolute blind panic. "We have absolutely nothing to do with this mess. We are completely innocent. We need to call our corporate defense lawyers immediately and distance ourselves from this massive criminal disaster." They did not even bother to say goodbye to their own daughter, Keisha. The wealthy, arrogant in-laws who had walked into my house looking down their noses at my working-class life were now running for the door like terrified rats fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. They scrambled out of the front door, slipping clumsily on the freezing snow in their expensive Italian shoes, desperately trying to escape the radioactive fallout of Preston's massive crime. I turned away from the pathetic display of wealthy cowardice and looked across the wooden table at Maya. My beautiful granddaughter was no longer crying. She was standing up, perfectly straight, looking at me with absolute awe and deep, overwhelming relief. She finally understood exactly what I had done. She knew that I had sacrificed my entire, massive real estate empire just to expose the monster who was trying to ruin her life. She knew her grandfather was not crazy. She knew I was her ultimate protector. I walked around the dining table and wrapped my heavy arms around her. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar sweet scent of her floral shampoo. "Do not worry about your college fund, sweetheart," I whispered softly into her ear. "Before I signed the trust over to the federal government, I legally carved out your entire educational fund and placed it in an untouchable independent account under my lawyer's direct control. Your medical school is completely paid for. You are going to be a brilliant pediatric surgeon, and nobody will ever steal your future again." Maya hugged me back incredibly tight, burying her face deep in my shoulder. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice full of pure, genuine love. Suddenly, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the dining room was pierced by a loud, aggressive wail. It was not a human cry. It was the sharp, piercing sound of multiple heavy sirens cutting fiercely through the freezing Detroit morning. Preston completely snapped out of his paralyzed state. He sprinted toward the large front window in the living room, pressing his face against the cold glass. His hands were shaking so violently they rattled loudly against the window pane. Bright, flashing red and blue lights instantly flooded my living room. The aggressive strobing lights cut sharply through the thin front curtains, painting the interior walls with the terrifying colors of absolute justice. The heavy tires of several armored black sport utility vehicles screeched to a sudden halt on the snow-covered asphalt right outside my front door. I could hear the loud, commanding voices of federal agents barking strict orders and the heavy mechanical sound of tactical weapons being racked and loaded. They did not send the local police detectives. They sent the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Preston slowly turned around to face me. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive tailored suit was violently wrinkled, his hair was a messy disaster, and his face was covered in a cold, terrified sweat. He fell heavily to his knees right in the middle of my living room floor, completely broken and entirely defeated. He finally realized that the old man he thought was a fool had just engineered his absolute destruction. "Checkmate," I said quietly, looking down at the man who used to be my son. The heavy wooden front door of my house did not just simply open. It was completely and violently breached. A massive, heavy steel battering ram smashed aggressively through the solid oak frame I had built and installed with my own 2 hands over 30 years ago. Large chunks of wood splintered and flew across the narrow hallway like dangerous shrapnel. I did not care about the severe physical damage to my property. As a master contractor, I learned a long time ago that you always have to break a few solid bricks if you want to completely fumigate a building that is deeply infested with rats. More than a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing thick, dark green tactical vests and heavy combat helmets swarmed rapidly into my small living room. They moved with the brutal, calculated efficiency of a highly trained military strike unit. They carried heavy tactical rifles and shouted overlapping aggressive commands that literally shook the very foundation of my walls. "Get down on the ground right now. Show me your empty hands. Do not move a single muscle or we will use absolute force." The sheer overwhelming volume and sudden extreme violence of the federal raid instantly paralyzed every single person in the dining room except for me. I just stayed perfectly still in my comfortable leather chair with my heavy arms wrapped protectively around my sweet granddaughter Maya. I pressed her face gently into my thick wool shoulders so she would not have to look directly at the terrifying heavy weapons pointed at her father. Preston did not try to run away. He did not try to fight back or argue the law like the arrogant, wealthy corporate titan he pretended to be just 5 short minutes ago. The exact moment the heavy black boots of the federal agents hit the living room floor, his entire fake sophisticated persona completely dissolved into absolute pathetic cowardice. He dropped flat onto his stomach, pressing his expensive cheek directly against the cold hardwood floor. He threw his soft, manicured hands behind his head, interlacing his trembling fingers in an act of total surrender. "Please do not shoot me," Preston screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail that sounded like a terrified child. "I am completely unarmed. I will cooperate with you. I will give you whatever you want. Just please do not shoot me." 2 massive federal agents immediately descended upon his prone body. They did not treat him with the gentle, polite respect he was so incredibly used to getting at his exclusive suburban country clubs. One heavy agent pressed a thick tactical knee firmly into the center of Preston's spine, pinning him completely flat against the wooden floorboards. The other federal agent forcefully grabbed his wrists, pulling his arms back at a deeply uncomfortable angle. The loud, sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping permanently shut around his wrists was the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire long life. It was the pure, undeniable sound of absolute final justice. They hauled him up roughly by the collar of his expensive tailored suit jacket, completely ignoring his pathetic, loud whimpering. But Preston was not the only arrogant rat caught in this massive federal trap today. Out in the front hallway, standing near the shattered remains of my oak door, Richard and Evelyn were aggressively pushed back inside the house by 3 more heavily armed agents. Richard was completely red in the face, puffing out his chest and desperately trying to use his booming executive business voice to intimidate the federal officers. "Do you have absolutely any idea who I am?" Richard yelled, waving his arms frantically in the air. "I am a highly respected corporate investor with deep political connections in this city. I have absolutely nothing to do with this pathetic excuse for a son-in-law. I demand that you let my wife and me leave this property immediately before I call my high-powered defense attorneys and have all of your badges taken away." The lead federal agent, a tall, highly intimidating man with cold gray eyes and a thick dark beard, walked slowly up to Richard. The agent did not shout or lose his temper. He simply pulled a folded white legal warrant from the pocket of his tactical vest and held it up to Richard's face. "Richard Caldwell," the agent said, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic room like a sharp steel knife. "You are currently listed as the primary corporate silent guarantor on 3 separate commercial loans attached to Preston's fraudulent offshore shell company. Our financial analysts have been tracking your specific wire transfers all morning. You are officially under arrest for criminal conspiracy to commit international wire fraud and severe federal tax evasion." The blood completely and instantly drained from Richard's arrogant face. The booming, confident businessman instantly turned into a terrified, weak-old coward. He finally realized that Preston had not just ruined his own life, but had actively dragged his wealthy father-in-law down into the federal abyss to use his money as collateral. Richard tried to take a slow, shaky step backward, but 2 federal agents immediately grabbed his arms and slammed him forcefully against the drywall of the hallway. The metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly for the 2nd time. Evelyn began screaming hysterically, dropping her expensive designer leather purse right onto the dusty floor. She watched in absolute total horror as her powerful, wealthy husband was aggressively frisked and treated exactly like a common street criminal. The massive corporate empire they had bragged about all afternoon at my dining table was completely crumbling to dust right in front of their terrified eyes. Keisha collapsed onto the floor, crying loudly as she watched both her husband and her father get permanently locked in federal chains. The tactical agents began forcefully pushing Preston toward the shattered front doorway. His expensive dark charcoal suit was completely ruined, covered in white drywall dust and pulled awkwardly around his shoulders. His face was entirely wet with terrified tears and heavy nervous sweat. As they dragged him roughly past the dining room table, he desperately dug his expensive shoes into the floor to stop his momentum. He locked his red, swollen eyes directly on Maya. He stopped fighting the federal agents for just one brief second, trying to play the tragic role of the loving father one last pathetic time. "Maya, please." Preston begged, his voice trembling with deep, desperate fear and absolute panic. "Please tell these men I am a good person. Please tell them I was just trying to secure our family future. I did it all for you, sweetheart. Everything I did was for your medical school. Tell your grandfather to call his civil lawyers and make this massive misunderstanding stop. Please, Maya, help me." I looked down at my beautiful granddaughter. I did not say a single word to influence her. I kept my heavy hands resting gently on her shoulders and let her make her own absolute choice. She slowly pulled away from my protective embrace. She stood up incredibly straight, wiping the final wet tear from her dark eyes. She looked directly at the pathetic handcuffed man who had lied to her, manipulated her mind, and maliciously stolen her entire college fund just to save his own skin. She took 2 slow, confident steps toward him. Preston managed to form a weak, desperate smile on his face, honestly thinking his teenage daughter was going to comfort him and validate his terrible lies in front of the federal agents. Instead, Maya raised her right hand high in the air and brought it directly across his face with every single ounce of strength she possessed in her young body. The physical slap was incredibly loud and powerful. It echoed through the entire living room like a heavy crack of summer thunder. Preston stumbled sideways, completely stunned by the sheer brutal force of the physical blow from his own child. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale, sweaty cheek, marking him permanently with his ultimate failure. "You are not my father," Maya said, her voice absolutely cold and completely steady without a single hint of fear. "You are just a pathetic coward and a disgusting thief. I never want to see your face ever again for the rest of my life." The federal agents did not reprimand Maya for the sudden physical violence. They simply grabbed Preston tightly by his suit collar and shoved him aggressively forward, dragging him roughly through the shattered front door and out into the freezing Detroit winter air. I walked slowly to the front doorway, holding Maya close to my side to protect her from the cold wind. We stood together and watched the ultimate physical destruction of Preston Caldwell from the front porch I had built. The entire working-class neighborhood had stepped out of their modest houses to watch the incredible flashing spectacle. The hard-working blue-collar people Preston had looked down on and mocked his entire adult life were now standing on their snow-covered lawns, quietly watching him being hauled away in heavy steel chains. They watched as his fake, wealthy superiority was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified criminal. The freezing winter wind whipped fiercely against his face as the federal agents pushed him forcefully toward the waiting armored black vehicle. He looked back at my house one last final time. He looked directly at me, standing strong, proud, and completely unbroken on the porch. He finally realized in that exact moment that the tired old mechanic he thought was completely useless had just masterminded his absolute permanent ruin. There was no secret wealthy offshore account waiting for him. There was no beautiful tropical island escape. There was only the cold, hard, solid concrete of a federal maximum security prison cell waiting to swallow him whole. As the heavy tactical agent shoved Preston's head down and violently pushed his body into the dark, cramped back seat of the federal cruiser, Preston let out a massive, agonizing scream. It was a long, horrific screaming sound of total, absolute despair that tore violently through the freezing morning air. It was the pure, undeniable sound of a completely broken, arrogant man watching the heavy steel doors of his own self-made hell slam permanently shut forever. The flashing red and blue lights of the dozens of police cruisers shined brightly through the falling white snow, reflecting beautifully off the front windows of my house. I pulled my granddaughter close against my chest, wrapping my heavy winter coat around her shoulders, knowing with absolute certainty that we were finally completely safe and our true legacy was protected forever. The heavy winter snow that had covered the city of Detroit on the morning of the federal raid eventually melted away, leaving behind the clean, bright promise of early spring. The chaotic flashing lights and the loud, aggressive sirens had long faded from my quiet working-class street. But the massive shockwaves of that Thanksgiving morning were still tearing completely through the wealthy suburban neighborhoods. Federal justice does not move slowly like the local civil courts. Federal justice moves like a massive, unstoppable freight train. Within 48 hours of his dramatic arrest, Preston's face was plastered all over the local evening news broadcasts. He was no longer the highly successful corporate real estate developer wearing expensive custom-tailored suits. He was just another desperate criminal wearing a cheap bright orange prison jumpsuit, sitting behind thick bulletproof glass in a federal detention center. The presiding federal judge completely denied him bail. The judge looked directly at the detailed flight risk assessment, noting the anonymous offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and instantly ordered Preston to remain locked in maximum security until his formal trial. Preston tried to call me from the prison telephone 3 separate times during that first week. I never answered a single call. I simply let the phone ring until the automated system disconnected. He had absolutely nothing left to say that I ever needed to hear. He had made his choice in the dark while I was sleeping, and now he had to live with the brutal, permanent consequences of the bright daylight. The absolute destruction of his fake luxury empire happened with breathtaking speed. Keisha filed for divorce the very next morning, trying desperately to distance herself from the massive radioactive fallout of his federal wire fraud. She hired aggressive corporate divorce attorneys hoping to claim half of his assets before the government could take them. But she quickly discovered the terrifying truth that I already knew. There were absolutely no assets left to divide. Preston's entire corporate structure was a hollow, bankrupt shell. The massive suburban mansion, the imported luxury cars, and the expensive designer jewelry were all systematically seized by federal agents to help pay back his angry, defrauded investors. Keisha was forced to pack her expensive clothes into cheap cardboard boxes and move back into her parents' house completely stripped of her fake high-class status. But her parents, Richard and Evelyn, were fighting their own desperate battles for survival. The federal investigators did not believe Richard's loud, arrogant claims of complete innocence. Because his signature was legally attached to Preston's fraudulent shell companies, the Internal Revenue Service launched a massive, relentless audit into every single one of Richard's corporate accounts. The wealthy, arrogant in-laws who had walked into my humble home and looked down their noses at my working-class life were now spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on criminal defense lawyers just trying to stay out of federal prison themselves. The pristine social reputation they worshipped above all else was completely shattered forever. While their fake world burned to the ground, my real world finally began to heal. Maya moved out of that toxic suburban environment and came to stay with me in my quiet house. The deep emotional wounds her father had inflicted on her took time to heal, but we built our new relationship on a foundation of absolute undeniable truth. We spent our evenings sitting on the front porch, drinking warm tea and talking about her complex medical studies. I never hid anything from her again, and she never doubted my sanity or my unconditional love. The massive $50,000 college fund that Preston had maliciously stolen from her was gone forever. But it did not matter. Before I had signed my $8 million real estate portfolio over to the federal government, my attorney Robert had legally carved out a totally untouchable educational trust exclusively for Maya. The money was securely locked away, where no greedy relative or desperate corporate banker could ever reach it. Her future was completely guaranteed. When the acceptance letter from the Advanced Summer Pediatric Medical Program finally arrived in the mail, we celebrated in my kitchen with simple, honest joy. She was going to be a brilliant surgeon, and she was going to use her life to heal people instead of destroying them. As for the rest of my massive real estate empire, I let it go completely, and I never looked back. The formal legal conversion of my family trust into the Federal Veteran Charity Trust was absolutely finalized by the courts. The remaining equity from the 14 commercial and residential properties I had built over my entire lifetime was successfully liquidated. The millions of dollars were directly distributed to massive national charity organizations that provided critical medical care and housing for disabled military veterans. I took the wealth I had built with my own 2 hands and I gave it back to the men and women who had actually bled for this country. But my work was not entirely finished. The horrifying experience with Preston opened my eyes to a very dark, terrifying reality. If my own flesh and blood could easily bribe a corrupt doctor to sign a fake medical certificate and steal my biometric fingerprint while I was heavily medicated, then there were thousands of other vulnerable elderly people out there suffering the exact same abuse. People who did not have my deep construction knowledge, people who did not have ruthless civil litigation attorneys on a secret retainer, people who simply surrendered to the greedy demands of their toxic children because they were too tired and too frightened to fight back. I took the small, modest pension I still had left from my 40 years at the auto plant, and I started a new local foundation right here in Detroit. I partnered directly with my private investigator Marcus and my attorney Robert. We created a free legal task force entirely dedicated to protecting elderly citizens from financial exploitation and familial abuse. We visited local community centers and church basements, holding free seminars on how to secure digital tablets, how to legally bulletproof retirement accounts, and how to spot the dangerous early warning signs of manipulative gaslighting from greedy relatives. We taught older men and women how to completely lock down their assets and how to fight back against the people who saw them only as expiring bank accounts. I found a completely new, profound purpose in my twilight years. I was no longer just a retired mechanic sitting alone in a big empty house waiting for Sunday dinners that were entirely built on lies. I was an active protector of my community, using my hard-earned wisdom to build strong defensive walls around the people who needed them the most. I built a new family entirely defined by mutual respect, absolute honesty, and fierce loyalty. One quiet evening, I sat alone in my heavy leather armchair, looking out the large front window as the warm spring rain washed the Detroit streets completely clean. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked slowly and steadily, marking the peaceful passage of time. The house was entirely quiet, but it was no longer a lonely silence. It was the deep, satisfying silence of a massive, hard-fought victory. I looked down at my thick, heavy hands. The deep scars and the permanent calluses were still there, mapping out a long, difficult lifetime of brutal physical labor. I had spent 40 years pulling double shifts, grinding heavy metal, and sacrificing my own physical comfort to build an empire for a son who ultimately tried to bury me alive. He honestly believed that, because I was old and because my hands were rough, my mind must be completely slow and useless. He believed that when I stopped arguing with him and simply went quiet, I had completely surrendered my dignity and accepted defeat. He made the absolute worst mistake a predator can possibly make. He severely underestimated his prey. People always seem to misunderstand the quiet nature of the older generation. They look at our gray hair, our slow, heavy steps, and our quiet demeanor, and they immediately assume we have lost our fighting spirit. They assume we are just passively waiting for the end of the road. They think our silence is a clear sign of weakness. They think it means we have finally given up and accepted whatever terrible fate they have selfishly planned for us. But they do not understand the brutal history we have survived. They do not understand the extreme racial and economic fires we had to walk through just to buy the very houses they now want to casually steal from us. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the strong, steady beat of my heart inside my chest. I thought about Preston sitting in his tiny, cold concrete cell, stripped of all his fake luxury, and facing the terrifying reality of 20 long years in federal prison. I thought about Maya studying her complex biology textbooks upstairs, completely safe and totally free to chase her beautiful dreams. I had successfully protected the innocent, and I had utterly destroyed the wicked without ever raising my voice or lifting a single violent fist. I leaned back into the comfortable leather, closing my eyes and letting the absolute peace of the quiet house wash completely over me. The silence of an older black man is never resignation, but time to aim. I also learned that your greatest weapon is not a massive bank account, but the quiet knowledge of how you built your life in the first place. The greedy people who look down on honest labor will never understand the immense strength it takes to lay a solid foundation, brick by brick. They foolishly think wealth is just something you can easily steal in the dark. But when you know exactly how the entire building was constructed, you also know exactly which pillars to strike to bring the rotten thing crashing down. You can always rebuild a physical house, but you can never rebuild a completely corrupt soul. If you have ever had to fight back against someone who severely underestimated your worth, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival.